All right. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's event. Sorry we're getting started a little bit late, but it's a great joy to have you all here for this debate between Dr. Jonathan McLatchie and Alex O'Connor, entitled Theism versus Naturalism, Which is a Better Account of Reality? My name is Bryant Miller, and I'll be moderating tonight's event. I received this honor by virtue of being president of the Sattler College Debate Club. Dr. McLatchie is our faculty advisor, and together we've put on this event, or planning and hosting it. The goal of Sattler College Debate Club is to equip its members with lifelong analytical and rhetorical skills. But more importantly, we also seek to hone our ability to discern truth from falsehood and defend the most important truths of all. This event is born from that desire. Represented are two opposing worldviews, theism and naturalism. The debaters chose the topic together and opted not to narrow it beyond the rather broad question, which provides a better account of reality? There are obviously myriad avenues that this debate could take, but I'm sure that given their skill, no matter where it goes, it will be a stimulating and interesting discussion. It is our hope that this debate will spark conversations and wrestlings for all present, whether in person or online. Welcome to those of you who are joining us online. And that it will inspire each of you to think more deeply about your own worldview, whether you identify more closely with either one of our speakers. But we also hope that it will serve to strengthen the dialogue and mutual respect between atheists and Christians, that it will be a bridge-building rather than a bridge-burning event. And I trust that, given the friendship between Dr. McLatchie and Alex O'Connor, that it will be just that. But I've talked long enough. You didn't come to hear me, so I'll turn it over to the debaters after a brief word on the format for tonight's event. First, we'll have opening statements, and they'll each have 20 minutes to both introduce themselves and explain their positions. And then there will be 12 minutes for first rebuttals, again for each speaker. The second rebuttals will be 6 minutes each, followed by a cross-examination where each debater will have 10 minutes to ask the other questions. And then we'll have roughly 20 minutes of question and answer time. So for those of you online, we will be fielding questions as well from the YouTube chat. And for those of you in person, also be thinking about questions as the debate progresses, and we'll have a time for you to ask those. And then wrapping up with a closing statement of 5 minutes from each speaker. So Dr. McLatchie will be speaking first, so I'll invite you to the podium, and let's welcome him with a round of applause.
Well, it's an honor and privilege to be here. Thank you all for coming out this evening to hear this very important debate about a very fascinating subject, theism versus naturalism. I'm Jonathan McLatchie. I'm on the biology faculty here at Sattler College. My passion in life is to teach people about the evidences for the truth of Christianity. I have a ministry called talkaboutdoubts.com where we mentor and disciple Christians who wrestle with doubts about their Christian faith, as well as ex-Christians who want to explore whether there might be a way back to faith, and we educate people about the evidence for that. So today we're going to be talking about the subject of the existence of God and which of those competing worldviews provides a better account of reality. Now there's, as Bryant mentioned, a number of different directions where this debate could go. We could talk about the fact the universe had a beginning, or the fine-tuning of the laws and constants of our universe. The universe appears to be balanced on a razor's edge for life to exist, such that if any of the fundamental constants of our universe, such as the cosmological constant or the ratio of the strong weak nuclear force and so on, were to vary by so much as a hair's breadth, then life of any form could not exist anywhere at any time in our universe. The evidence of biological design, or the evidence for the truth of Christianity. Now, of course, my time is limited this evening, so I'm going to be focusing on the evidence of biological design first, and then we'll talk about the evidence for the truth of Christianity, because obviously if Christianity is true, that an entailment of that is that God exists. So First argument I want to present then is the argument from biological information. Those of you who have taken my freshman biology class will recognize this figure and the concept here. This is the central dogma of molecular biology, which describes the information processing inside the world of the cell. And we've come to understand as scientists that the cell, of which our body is comprised of about 100 trillion, is chock full of digitally encoded information content in the form of the nucleotide base pairs that run along the sugar phosphate backbone of the DNA molecule, which are represented by the alphabetic characters of A, C, T, and G, which represent those chemical subunits. And in every realm of experience, when we find information in the world, especially in a digital form, whether that be in a hieroglyphic inscription or newspaper headline or digital computer programming script or something like that, then we always habitually associate that with an intelligent, conscious agent. And so when we find information intrinsic to the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA, I would argue that the best explanation is that it too arose by virtue of an intelligent cause. We could also, I also want to mention the genetic code, which describes the relationships between codons, which are the words, if you will, in the genetic language, that specify different amino acids, which form the building blocks of proteins. And as you can see, there's this mapping from these three-letter words called codons to amino acids that they specify. And again, in every realm of experience, when you find codes and coding conventions, we uniformly associate that with an intelligent, conscious agent. And so I would submit to you that it's more probable that this sort of feature would exist in the world on the supposition of theism than it is on its falsehood. And so it tends to confirm the theistic hypothesis that God exists. We could also talk about the fine-tuning of the genetic code. So the genetic code has been shown, and there's a lot of papers published on this subject, to be very highly optimized for error minimization. So the genetic code that's found in nature is exquisitely tuned to protect the cell from the detrimental effects of substitution mutations. In fact, the system is so brilliantly set up that codons that differ only by a single base or a single letter either specify the same amino acid or an amino acid that's a member of a related chemical group. And so that dampens the effects of substitution errors. In other words, the structure of the genetic code is set up to mitigate the effects of errors that might be incorporated during translation. And that's actually just one level of the multi-layered fine-tuning of the genetic code. Now, how might you evolve a genetic code by evolution? Well, changes in the codon assignments, that is the mapping between the codons and amino acids over time, would be catastrophic to the cell, because such a mutation would ultimately lead to changes to the amino acid sequence in every protein produced by the cell. This means that one cannot have a significantly evolving genetic code over time, because it would wreak havoc. You're changing every polypeptide made by the cell as you change that codon to amino acid convention. Now, some have tried to argue around this by positing that the lesser used codons could be redesignated to a different but related amino acid and thus allow the genetic code to become optimized. But there are a lot of difficulties with that suggestion. For one thing, it's very improbable in my view that by virtue of replacing some of the lesser used amino acid assignments with a related amino acid that one could attain the level of optimization that we find in the conventional code. Another argument I want to present is the argument from irreducible complexity in biological systems. So this is an argument actually that goes back to Charles Darwin, at least put forward a means by which you could potentially test and falsify his theory of evolution by natural selection. And he says if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And in 1996, Michael Behe, a biochemist at Lehigh University, came out with a book called Darwin's Black Box, where he sought to take up Darwin's challenge, and he coined this concept called irreducible complexity. And he says, by irreducible complex, I mean a single system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. So he gave an example from everyday usage, the mousetrap, which has a platform, it has a spring, it has a hammer, it has a hold-down bar, it has a catch, it has staples that hold the trap together. And if any of those parts were missing, you wouldn't have a trap that caught half as many mice as it used to, or a quarter as many mice as it used to. No, it would be broken. And so how do you, by slight successive modification, without knowing where you're going, assemble a contraption like a mousetrap? Now, it turns out that biology is chock full of irreducibly complex systems like the mousetrap. Now, why is irreducible complexity evidence of design, though? Well, explaining the origins of irreducibly complex features requires a cause that possesses foresight to bring about. Only intelligence can visualize a complex, higher-level objective and bring together everything needed to realize or to actualize that end goal. And so the fact that we discover these irreducibly complex nanomachines at the level of the cell is not hugely surprising on the supposition that a mind was involved, but is wildly surprising on its falsehood, on the hypothesis of naturalism. Now, many of you might know about William Paley, who was a famous Christian philosopher. He's most famous for his book Natural Theology. He was also a fantastic Bible scholar. If you haven't read any of his biblical stuff, I highly recommend his book A View of the Evidence of Christianity, as well as Hora Paulinae, or The Times of Paul. Fantastic work. An intellectual hero of mine. So he says famously in his Natural Theology, "In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer, but suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think that the answer I had before given, that for anything I knew the watch might have always been there. There must have existed at some time, and at some place or other, or an artificer or artificers who formed the watch for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation." Now, Paley has gone on, of course, to be vindicated by our modern advances in the life sciences, where we now understand the molecular basis of life and the incredible complexity of molecular systems. I'm just going to show a short animation, this is only a minute long, which shows the process of DNA replication. This is produced by a guy called Drew Berry, who's a biological animator. So this is how DNA is copied to prepare for cell division.
DNA replication is carried out by a molecular machine called the replisome that pulls apart the double helix and makes an exact copy of each strand. In this visualization, we're going to examine the mechanism for copying DNA. The enzyme DNA polymerase synthesizes DNA molecules, using the original molecule as a template for the production of a complementary strand. The genetic code in the template strand is paired to free-floating bases, matching cytosine to guanine and adenine to thymine. DNA polymerase creates an exact copy of your DNA code, making less than one mistake in a billion bases.
So in my opinion, systems like this should completely settle the debate over whether there's a creator or not. The complexity and engineering prowess of these molecular systems is absolutely mind-blowing. Now, so let me just break this down a little bit further. So this is how DNA replicates. So you have the double strands of DNA, and you've got the chemical subunits A pairs with T and C pairs with G. And DNA is replicated in a semi-conservative manner. So you've got the two strands separated, and each of the parent strands serves as a template for the synthesis of a new complementary strand. And so the purpose is for the cell to split into two daughter cells. Each cell needs a copy of the genetic material, the DNA. Now here's a diagram that shows the complexity and the different proteins involved in replicating DNA. So you have to have, for example, the initiation proteins that perform the initial unwinding of the DNA double helix. You have to have the helicase that breaks the hydrogen bonds that hold the double strands together to separate the DNA. You have to have the single-stranded binding proteins to prevent the DNA from reannealing during copying. You have to have the polymerase that actually performs the copying, which is built in with an error-correcting mechanism, so it actually does a proofreading function. You have to have primers, because the DNA polymerase isn't able to start synthesizing DNA on its own without a free, what's called a 3' hydroxyl group. And so it requires an RNA short segment to be synthesized by an enzyme called primase in order for DNA polymerase to continue. You have to have topoisomerases to alleviate supercoiling that's induced because of the torsional stress on the double helix, like a telephone cord, an old telephone cord. You have to have a sliding clamp that clamps the DNA polymerase on to the strand of DNA. You have to have a clamp loader that loads the sliding clamp on. You have the lagging strand, one of the strands of DNA, has to actually be synthesized backwards because the strands of DNA are anti-parallel to each other, going opposite directions. So what's called the lagging strand is looped around and synthesized discontinuously in short fragments. So there's basically multiple RNA primers that are synthesized and short fragments of DNA called Okazaki fragments that have to be glued together by an enzyme called ligase, and then the primers get removed by excision enzymes and replaced by DNA and so forth. And so if any of those parts were missing, you wouldn't have DNA replication that worked half as efficiently as it used to, or a quarter as efficiently as it used to, but it would be broken. So what would happen if you knocked out the following components? So without the DNA polymerase, no replication could take place at all. So you'd get the RNA primers laid down at the origin of replication, but no further replication. So DNA ligase links the DNA fragments that are produced on the lagging strand. In the absence of ligase, the newly replicated DNA strands remain as fragments. Without the sliding clamp, the DNA polymerase will frequently fall off the DNA template. It will be too inefficient for replication. In the absence of RNA excision enzymes, the RNA fragments will remain covalently attached to the newly replicated DNA fragments. Without the DNA helicase, the DNA polymerase will stall because it cannot separate the strands of the template DNA ahead of it, and so little or no new DNA will be synthesized. In the absence of primase, RNA primers cannot begin on either the leading or the lagging strand, so DNA replication can't begin. Without the single-stranded binding proteins, the DNA strands would reanneal before they could be copied. And without the topoisomerase enzymes, the DNA would supercoil and eventually break. So as I said, without any of those components, you don't have DNA replication that works half as efficiently as it used to, or quarter as efficiently, but it's broken. And I cherry-picked this particular example because, unlike some other examples of irreducible complexity, which are also valid arguments, like the bacterial flagellum, for example, this one cannot really be reduced, because having self-replication is a prerequisite for differential survival. And differential survival, some organisms surviving better than others, is a prerequisite for natural selection. So you can't invoke natural selection to explain the existence of self-replication without assuming the existence of the very thing you're trying to explain. So let's move on to the next argument, which is the evidence for the truth of Christianity. Because, of course, if Christianity is true, then God exists, right? That's pretty quite an obvious entailment. So there's multiple lines of evidence for Christianity. I have at least 6 different lines of evidence I would present if I had enough time for the truth of Christianity. You've got the evidence for Jesus' resurrection. You've got the trilemma argument that was developed by C.S. Lewis originally. You've got the argument from messianic prophecy. You've got the conversion of the Apostle Paul. And you've got the argument from contemporary miracles, which has been documented in particular by Craig Keener in his 2-volume set on miracles. Lee Strobel also has a book called The Case for Miracles. And then you've also got the survival of the nation of Israel against all odds, even in spite of the Assyrian invasion under Sennacherib of Assyria, the Babylonian exile, the Persian conquest, Haman, the Maccabees against Antiochus Epiphanes, the Seleucid tyrant against the Roman siege in the 60s AD, culminating in the sacking of Jerusalem in AD 70, and the dispersal of the Jewish people, and then, of course, the Nazi Holocaust. In spite of all those trials, the nation of Israel, or the people of Israel, have retained their national identity, which is highly expected if Christianity is true, somewhat surprising on its falsehood. Now, let's consider just one of these evidences in detail, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, or at least in some detail. So this is the way the argument would be structured. So there's overwhelming evidence that the Gospels and Acts are written by individuals who are close up to the facts, well-informed, and habitually scrupulous. That being the case, this provides evidence that confirms that the claims in the Gospels concerning the resurrection reflect what the eyewitnesses, or the purported eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, were claiming. So how do we explain any testimonial claim? Well, for any testimonial claim, whether we're talking about a sexual assault allegation or witness to a miracle or whatever it happens to be, there are 3 and only 3 broad categories of explanation that could perhaps explain why they made the claim. One is that the claimant lied. One is that the claimant was honestly mistaken. One is that the claimant was correct. And to the extent that we can reduce the plausibility of those 2 first explanations, we can redistribute the probabilities and increase significantly the probability of this last option, that the claimant was in fact correct. So if you imagine a sexual assault allegation and the claimant gives a very detailed elaboration of what happened, of the incident, and it's the sort of description that couldn't plausibly have been subject to being honestly mistaken. And perhaps the claimant came forward at great expense to themselves or against their own self-interest. Well, that would reduce the plausibility of those two contending explanations and increase the plausibility of the third explanation. Now, let's come to the resurrection itself. So I would argue that the circumstances of the Christian claims of Jesus' resurrection makes it enormously improbable that they were lying, that they were setting out to deceive people. For one thing, the apostles were willing to voluntarily undergo labors and dangers and hardships and persecutions and sufferings on account of, in some cases martyrdom, on account of their Christian testimony. And that is, liars make poor martyrs. It's very surprising, on the hypothesis that they're making stuff up deliberately, setting out to deceive people, that they would be willing to endure such persecutions and hardships and dangers against their own self-interest. You could also bring to bear other arguments which also contribute to lowering the probability of that hypothesis, such as the fact that they use women witnesses, for example, as the chief discoverers of the empty tomb, fulfilling the criterion of embarrassment, which is somewhat surprising if they're making stuff up because of the low status of women in the patriarchal society that was in ancient Palestine, with the testimony of a woman being worth only a fraction of that of a male witness. Why use women across all four Gospels if, in fact, they were just making stuff up or felt at liberty and were not constrained by what actually happened in historical reportage. Secondly, the content of the Christian claims of Jesus' resurrection makes it enormously improbable that they were honestly mistaken. They involve not just individual sightings, but group sightings, group conversations with Jesus, long discourses with Jesus, physical contact with Jesus, eating broiled fish with Jesus, eating breakfast with Jesus on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. According to Acts 1, it was extended across a 40-day time period, so not just a brief and confusing episode. And so that makes it enormously improbable that they were honestly mistaken. These are the sorts of testimonial claims about which it's very difficult to be honestly mistaken. And so therefore, I contend that the evidence favors the hypothesis that Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead. And so with that, I rest my case. I think that, just to summarize, we have the evidence from biology that points to a designer, creator of biological life, living organisms, and that observation, that discovery, is far more probable, I submit to you, on the hypothesis that that we live in a theistic universe than it is on naturalism. And then we've looked at the resurrection claim, and I submit to you that the evidence for the resurrection, though we've only been able to scratch the surface of the surface, is very compelling evidence for the truth of Christianity, which contributes to a broader cumulative case for Christianity in particular. And since Christianity is true, that in turn entails the existence of God. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. McLatchie. And I'll now turn it over to Alex O'Connor. You can introduce yourself and give your opening statement.
Let me know when I've got 2 minutes remaining. I can introduce myself as long as it doesn't come out of my time. My name is Alex. I am a graduate of philosophy and theology, and I'm a YouTuber. And that's about all there is to me, I'm afraid. But I'm ready when you are. If you could let me know when I've got 2 minutes remaining, just by saying 2 minutes, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, of course, Brian and Jonathan and Sattler College and ladies and gentlemen for coming. This is the second time that I've engaged with Jonathan publicly. I'm glad to pick up where we left off. We didn't quite get to the bottom of God's existence last time. I'm confident we might get there today. I wonder, it'd be quite interesting just to get a feel of the room, actually. How many people here are Christians? Is that the time? Okay, well, it looks like I've got my work cut out for me, but that's my favourite kind of debate, I think. Of course, this is an opening statement, so I won't respond to the arguments you just heard just yet. Instead, I want to make my own case that upon an honest analysis of the world we find ourselves in, it should compel us to dismiss the hypothesis of a supernatural creator. I will not be asking you to look in ancient scripture, nor to the beginning of the universe, nor indeed down a microscope, instead just to your direct experience of the world, and facts about the lives of people within it. I will, however, indulge in a brief biblical recital, because I want to begin with a reading from the book of Psalms. So if you could all turn to Psalm 139, unless, of course, you've already committed this famous passage to memory. Verse 7 onwards reads, "Where can I go from your presence? Or where can I flee from your spirit? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths of the Sheol, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and settle at the farthest limits of the sea, even there your hand shall guide me, and your right hand shall hold me fast." This poem in its entirety is given by the NRSV a title, "The Inescapable God." It's a message of bold reassurance to the believer, reminding them that since God is present everywhere, pervading every inch of our universe, he is, in the happiest sense possible, inescapable. But my first argument, and it's going to be the first of three, against the viability of theism, flows from the demonstrable fact that this divine consolation is seemingly not offered universally, and often in fact restricted from those who want it the most. I'm going to be making the claim specifically that atheism or naturalism provides a better account for three facts of our universe. The first being the hiddenness of God. The second being the geographical, statistical arrangement, shall we say, of religious belief. And the third will be the problem of gratuitous suffering, and we'll see if we get time to finish it off. Far from being unable to escape God, there is a very real contingent of non-believers, and I would count myself among their number, who are unable by any means to discover him, who seek and do not find, who knock and receive, as it were, no answer. This strange phenomenon is known as the problem of divine hiddenness. If there is a God, then simply, why is he hidden from so many of us so much of the time? If theism is to offer a sufficient account of reality, then it must offer an account of what J.L. Schellenberg has famously labelled non-resistant non-belief, which he distinguishes from resistant non-belief. It's sometimes said by a theist who wishes to explain the problem of divine hiddenness that people simply disbelieve through their own fault. They're too stubborn. They're purposefully blinding themselves to the evidence because they don't want it to be true. They're not approaching the arguments honestly with an open heart, and that if they would only do this, then God would surely reveal himself. Such a person would be what Schellenberg calls a resistant non-believer. He disbelieves, in some sense, because he actively resists it. For what it's worth, I do think that such people exist. I think many such people exist. There are people who come to this debate with their minds already made up. There are people who want it not to be true, that God exists, and in fact wouldn't submit to that truth even if it were true. There was a recent poll run by the Atheist Experience YouTube channel, which I know, Jonathan, you're a fan of, which asked, if there was a God, would you worship it? To which an astonishing 85% of respondents said that they would not. There are, however, also people who disbelieve in God, not out of resistance or stubbornness or a hardened heart, but rather due to sheer lack of conviction. Indeed, many such people actively want to be convinced of God's existence and would jump at the chance of entering into a relationship with him if they thought that he did. But no matter how hard they search, they simply find no answer forthcoming from the heavens, and this is the non-resistant non-believer. Formally, then, Schellenberg's problem of divine hiddenness can be stated as follows. Premise 1, if there is a God, he is perfectly loving, something I'm pretty sure Jonathan agrees with. Premise 2, if a perfectly loving God exists, non-resistant non-belief does not occur. Premise 3, non-resistant non-belief does occur. 4, therefore, no perfectly loving God exists, and the conclusion from the first premise is that therefore there is no God. A loving God, like the Christian God, would surely not refuse any willing person from developing a relationship with him, and so if somebody is truly non-resistant and open to receiving God's grace, we should expect them to receive it. Thus, Schellenberg's assertion that if God exists, then non-resistant non-belief does not exist. The question, then, is there such a thing as non-resistant non-belief, a non-resistant non-believer? To which all I can really say is, nice to meet you. The last time I debated Jonathan a number of years ago, when I was just a few months out of being a teenager, I said that even if I found Christianity to be true, I still wouldn't want to worship the God that it promotes. I now, since then, have realized how irrational and self-defeating this assertion is, and stand before you today as an example of a non-resistant non-believer. I think it would be great if God existed. I really do. I would absolutely love to escape death. I would relish being the recipient of unconditional love. Less selfishly, I would love to be able to worship that which deserves to be worshipped. I just don't think it's true. Now, try as I might, look where I can, I find no response, no hint, nothing. I don't choose to disbelieve in God any more than I choose to disbelieve in aliens, despite how much I might want them to. So when faced with a psalm like Psalm 139, I'm overwhelmed with a sense not of beauty and consolation, but envy and disappointment. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Where can I go, I should ask in response, to find it? Of course, you cannot know my heart. You can't know if I'm truly as non-resistant as I claim, but I hope that my actions here might betray me. As a Catholic child, I was once an altar boy. I would serve the altar of Mother Church every Sunday dressed in a white robe. In the time since then, I have, to put it mildly, been looking for God. I went to Catholic schools. I studied philosophy and theology at A-levels. I made a career out of engaging with religious arguments. I have explored arguments from contingency, from fine-tuning, from motion, from mathematics, from irreducible complexity and the alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. It may surprise my followers online to learn that at university I visited numerous churches on the invitation of various friends. I spent hours talking with religious friends until the sun rose again, if you like. I attended Bible groups regularly too, which might surprise people as well. And in fact, I still do attend such groups. Just recently, I agreed to embark on a series of study of the wisdom literature, specifically reading it again in the hopes that this time I might finally feel a divine presence seeping from between the lines. I moved into a house for a year with 2 devoutly Christian housemates, with the express intention of seeing if the obvious truth of Christianity and theism that people like to talk about can be found in the minutiae of daily life. I have looked, in other words, in a great deal of places. I read Athanasius and Anselm. I read Augustine and Aquinas. I looked in Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena. I looked at the sociological origin of religious belief in Durkheim and Marx and Freud and Young. I looked at religious experience in William James and Rudolf Otto. I've looked in the modern works of people like Ed Feser and Bill Craig and Michael Murray and Richard Swinburne and Alvin Plantinga. I've looked in poetry. I've looked in the Psalms. I've looked in Job. I've looked in Ecclesiastes. I've looked in Dostoevsky. I read C.S. Lewis. I listened to worship music. I prayed. I studied the gospel. I even got an actual degree in theology from a university. And nothing, not once, not nearly, not ever, not even briefly have I experienced anything that speaks to the existence of a God in the universe. I think it's asking a lot of any atheist to seriously engage with a religion that he does not believe is true in any circumstances. But I feel like I have gone above and beyond what can be reasonably expected of any atheist who wishes to entertain the God hypothesis, and for my effort I have been awarded radio silence. The inescapable God of the NRSV, in other words, is for me the invisible God, or the inapproachable God, the deaf, distant God. The best account that I can give of this experience, of complete and utter silence from deaf heaven, is that all that truly exists to me is impersonal space and air and rocks. I know, it sucks. I'm sorry. It's a shame, but there's no need to cry about it. And nothing more. My question to Jonathan, then, is simple. How can theism account for this lived experience? How can it account, in other words, for non-resistant non-belief? And if atheism, doesn't atheism, offer a better explanation at the very least? Am I a non-resistant non-believer? If so, what offers a best account, or a better account, of such a condition? A universe in which there is a loving God who does want to be my friend, but is for some reason refusing, or hiding, or toying with me? Or a universe without one? Or is there no such thing as a non-resistant non-believer, which is the only remaining option? Do we all secretly resist in some way or other? After desperately, in other words, trying to convince myself of God's existence for years and being left painfully unconvinced, will you just submit, as if to add insult to this spiritual injury, that this is in some way my fault? And if it is, then what could I have done differently? What should I be doing differently? What could I possibly have done differently given the course of my life? Now, assume for a moment, ladies and gentlemen, the alternative hypothesis of naturalism, of atheism, and ask if it provides a good account of non-resistant non-belief. And I think the answer is obvious. But it does get worse yet. You'll remember that my second fact that I said that I would bring up is the geographical predictability of religious belief. Not only does theism need to account for non-resistant non-belief, but also for the fact that such belief is unequally present across the globe. Stephen Mason has pointed out that the populace of Saudi Arabia is 95% Muslim and therefore 95% theistic, whereas the populace of Thailand is 95% Buddhist and therefore, at best, 5% theistic. How likely you are to be a theist, in other words, is intimately tied to the place in which you happen to be born. What can better explain this geographical spread? Theism or naturalism or atheism? Well, let's consider our two competing hypotheses. Could it be that God does exist, but that the Thai are simply naturally 20 times more likely to be resistant to belief in God than, say, the Saudis? Are they just naturally 20 times more stubborn or something? This seems implausible. This doesn't seem to be their fault. Okay, so maybe then it's not their fault, and God just has some reason to hide his face disproportionately more from the Thai than from Saudis, or indeed from those born here in Massachusetts, which has a theistic, according to one statistic, is 75% theistic. If theism is true, it seems to me that God has a lot to answer for here. Is it not troubling, Jonathan, for as a Christian, that your place of birth is a reliable statistical indicator of how likely you are to be saved? I'll say that again. Your place of birth, which is entirely arbitrary, is a reliable indicator of how likely you are on Christianity to be saved. You're significantly more likely to be a theist if you're born in Rwanda than if you're born in Thailand. Can this situation really obtain under the supervision of a God who wants to come to know us and makes his existence equally accessible to all? The chances seem infinitely small. Now consider naturalism or atheism. Religion varying by region is exactly what we would expect if it is a man-made cultural phenomenon, and nothing like what we should expect if there is, in fact, one true God who loves all equally. Again, I think atheism provides a much stronger account of this fact of our world. Finally, then, the third fact of our universe, which is gratuitous suffering. Gratuitous here means something like unjustified or unwarranted or meaningless. I do this because it's easy to see how some instances of suffering may be beneficial in certain circumstances, or necessary to bring about some desirable state of affairs, some desirable end. But the existence of meaningless or unnecessary suffering does seem to be incompatible with the existence of a God who loves us and has the power to prevent it from happening. We're sometimes told that God has morally sufficient reason to allow suffering to exist. Indeed, if God is good, then he must have such sufficient reason. Perhaps suffering is necessitated by human free will. Perhaps suffering helps to develop a person's moral character, or maybe it's necessary to achieve some other end that God wishes to bring about. But intuitively, there appear to be instances of suffering that cannot serve any such end. And if even one example of these turns out to be an actual case of unnecessary or meaningless suffering, this would be enough to cause a problem. I want to propose something that might sound a little strange at first, which is that the biggest problem for theism here is not, famously, the great, intense sufferings of the world, like holocausts or earthquakes, but rather menial, less significant suffering, like being caught out in the rain, or stubbing your toe, or tripping over a curb on the street. Why? This seems a tad absurd, I'll grant you that, but consider this. When we experience a great suffering, like the death of a loved one, or a devastating earthquake, or indeed a holocaust, it's easy to imagine that this might somehow be part of a grand plan. The depth of our suffering may make us into better people. The people who die may be experiencing a much happier state of affairs in the afterlife now. Perhaps by allowing the Jewish Holocaust to take place, God makes it such that we are far less likely to allow even worse projects of genocide to occur in the future. But what could possibly be served? What possible end could be served? What possible meaning could there be in subbing your toe, or tripping over a curb, or having a pigeon use your new suit as a restroom? Such instances are not significant. They're usually forgotten within a day or two, and therefore do not and cannot develop the soul. Nor do they seem plausibly part of some grand design or plan. They seem, that is to say, meaningless and unnecessary. More meaninglessness than instances of, let's say, great or intense suffering, much more meaningless than these. And truly meaningless, unnecessary suffering is certainly more expected in a world without benevolent supervision than in a theistic paradigm. A successful theodicy, in other words, then, needs to provide not only an account of the great and intense sufferings of the world, but also the menial sufferings which pervade the human experience. Now, I'm actually quite surprised that I've made it this far without mentioning animals yet. It's quite unlike me, but that's a final consideration that does deserve our attention. Whatever theodicy might explain human suffering, the existence of animal suffering seems infinitely more difficult to explain. Animals are not free in the way that we are, and so are immune to the free will defense. They cannot morally develop in the way that we can, and so are immune to soul-making theodicies. They are, on most accounts, not going to heaven, and so they will not be compensated for their suffering. Yet their suffering is immeasurably large. Somewhere, right now, billions of animals are suffering in the wild, from predation, from disease, from hunger, from fear. Imagine a deer with its leg caught under a fallen tree, dying of starved confusion. It doesn't know why it's there. It feels hungry, it's starving to death, and it's trapped under a tree, and it has no idea why. What could possibly be the purpose or meaning of this? I'll remind you that this is exactly the kind of thing that we should expect to see if the natural world is an amoral arena of accidentally existing organisms fighting with each other to stay alive. But can we really expect this on theism? Should we expect this on theism? What offers a better account? Keep in mind that, in other words, I'm not arguing that theism can offer no account of these kinds of situations and sufferings, though I am skeptical that it can. I'm only arguing that assuming that theism is false offers a better account of it than assuming that theism is true. Assume atheism, assume that human beings and other animals are nothing more than evolved creatures who developed pain receptors to make them more prone to avoiding the menial and great sufferings that upset our survival prospects. On this account, the existence of all suffering, small and great, is not only explained, but expected. Thus, atheism offers a better account, in my view, than theism of three crucial and unavoidable facts: divine hiddenness, geographical religious statistics, and the existence of gratuitous human and non-human suffering. And I am truly excited to hear how Jonathan might account for these on theism in defending it as a more plausible account of our reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your very intense description of your own personal experience. I appreciated your willingness to bare your soul, if you will, before us. I'll now turn it over to Dr. McLatchie again for his first rebuttal. You'll have 12 minutes.
Well, thank you, Alex, for your thoughtful and at times moving opening statement. I appreciate it very much. Now, Alex has raised essentially two lines of argument against the existence of God: divine hiddenness and the problem of evil. So I'll begin my rebuttal first with a discussion of divine hiddenness. So my view on divine hiddenness is that I trust the goodness of God. I think that there's very powerful evidence to think Christianity is true, and so I trust God's goodness as revealed in Scripture, and God, presumably in his omniscience, knows what every person would have done had they had more evidence, i.e. whether they would have chosen to enter into a relationship with God or to reject him. We know from plenty of biblical examples that not everyone who's presented with sufficient evidence for God, whether by miracles, predictive prophecies, direct manifestations, etc., submit to him. if God knows that a given individual is not going to enter into a good, lasting relationship with him, then why would God ensure the person believes? Furthermore, Scripture also indicates that people are judged in accordance with the amount of light that they have rejected. Even many contemporary public atheists have essentially said that no amount of evidence could change their mind. For example, Richard Dawkins was asked in conversation with Peter Boghossian what it would take for him to believe in God, and Dawkins said that not even the second coming would be enough evidence. When Boghossian asked him whether any amount of evidence could change his mind, he replied, "Well, I'm starting to think nothing would," which in a way goes against the grain, because I've always paid lip service to the view that a scientist should change his mind when evidence is forthcoming. It could therefore be seen as an act of mercy for God to withhold from them more evidence if they were going to reject it anyway, and thereby bring upon themselves greater judgment. This adds yet further plausible motivation for God not to ensure that everyone had greater access to evidence for his existence, which would thereby render them more culpable. This point has been independently made by Travis Dumsday in a paper in the Journal of Religious Studies. This last point may be challenged by the skeptic by pointing to the existence of non-resistant non-believers, as Alex, of course, did. Now, he mentioned John Schellenberg, who's the champion advocate of this argument from non-resistant non-believers. And he says, and I'm quoting, "If there exists a God who is always open to a personal relationship with any finite person, then no finite person is ever non-resistantly in a state of non-belief in relation to the proposition that God exists." End quote. But I would question whether there is such a thing as long-term non-resistant non-belief. So my own view is that the evidence for Christianity is such that anyone who is fully informed and takes it upon himself to impartially examine the evidence with a heart open toward accepting God as Lord will, in the long run, come to find Christianity to be true and well supported. In any case, human psychology, particularly at the subconscious level, is so complex that I doubt it's demonstrable that any non-believer is completely non-resistant throughout the course of their lives. A related objection is that it's possible for the evidence for Christianity to have been stronger than it in fact is. Surely, if God existed, he would have given us the strongest possible evidence. But I don't think that we need to expect something that goes beyond perfectly adequate evidence for the serious inquirer. Many atheists are under the mistaken impression that God wants people to believe in him, no matter what they are going to do, go on and do with that knowledge. It's never contended anywhere in Scripture that it's a commendable thing to believe in God yet reject a relationship with him. In the Old Testament, the Jews had no doubt that God existed. They had even seen many miracles performed before their very eyes, and yet they went off time and again into idolatry. Even those who saw Jesus' miracles before their very eyes didn't believe in him. Such as in John 12:37, for instance. And they wanted to put him to death. For example, see the reaction of many after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead. Now, the 18th century lawyer and Christian thinker, Joseph Butler, another hero of mine, in his Analogy of Religion, put forward the idea that our time on earth is a period of probation. For some people in particular, the form that probation may take is a form of testing whether they are willing to engage in the intellectual inquiry that is necessary to give themselves a fair examination of the evidence. An objection I sometimes encounter is that if God existed, then there should be not be any reasonable arguments against his existence at all. But this complaint, it seems to me, boils down essentially to the dubious claim that if Christianity is true, there cannot be any puzzles that require mental effort to work out or to decipher. Another point to bear in mind is that many people are not even presented with these as puzzles that seriously compromise the evidence that they already have. For some people, working through the problem of evil is part of their probation here in this life. And if they are diligent, they will work through that problem. Even if they cannot find adequate and satisfying answers to why there exists so much suffering in the world, they can learn to trust in the goodness of God and find in the problem of evil insufficient ground to overturn the avalanche of positive confirmatory evidence for biblical theism. Either they will find adequate answers, or they will find enough positive evidence to make the fact of their inability to find those answers not, in the end, sufficient to undermine their faith. I often hear the objection that in order to really be compelled by the evidence for Christianity, one has to take a very deep dive into esoteric scholarship. And if God were real, the truth of the gospel should be a lot more self-evident. And this is sometimes also an objection that is raised to my epistemology from other Christians as well. namely that my hardline evidentialism implies that Christians cannot be rational in believing the gospel unless they become an academic and invest hundreds of hours in the study of the evidences for Christianity. And since not everyone has the aptitude and access to resources necessary to undertake such deep study, so the objection goes, this cannot be God's normative way of imparting rational confidence to believers that the gospel they have entrusted is indeed true. However, I want to be careful here to draw a distinction between what I call explicit rational warrant and what can be called an implicit or tacit rational warrant for Christian faith. Every Christian, I would argue, can have at least an implicit rational warrant for believing that God exists and that he's revealed himself in the Bible. For example, Romans 1:20 teaches that God's attributes are revealed through natural theology, through creation. The psalmist also writes that the heavens declare the glory of God and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Now, I don't think that Scripture is envisioning people having to go and get themselves PhDs in astrophysics or molecular biology or master probability theory to see the hand of God revealed in nature. Every time we step outdoors and behold the things that God has made, especially living organisms, we intuit that things have been made for a purpose, even if we couldn't explicitly express why that is the case. Indeed, throughout history, the vast majority of people who have lived have been theists. In fact, even a biologist as staunchly atheistic as Francis Crick, the co-discoverer with James Watson of the double helical structure of the DNA molecule, said that biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Richard Dawkins similarly said at the beginning of The Blind Watchmaker that biology is a study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed with a purpose. And Dawkins then spends the remainder of the book trying to argue, in my opinion unsuccessfully, that this design is not real, but only apparent. So where am I going with all this? So I would argue that discovering evidence for God is not actually that hard. Rather, it's been made artificially hard by bad scholarship and poor standards that insist that the simplest answer cannot actually be the correct answer. And this is true, I think, in both science and biblical scholarship. A lot of ink has been spilled that's been spilled on these issues. Is ink spent answering really bad arguments that should never have gotten traction to begin with. But because they provide an excuse for unbelief, they have become widely accepted and highly esteemed, even among academics who should know better. Now, of course, I grant that Christianity is not immediately obvious in the same sense that theism is. However, since the manifest evidence of design in nature renders it non-obvious that there is nothing to the Christian claim, given the stakes involved, it is, I would argue, incumbent on one to investigate the claims of the gospel for themselves, almost to the same extent that it would be if one were very nearly persuaded of its truth. And I'm convinced that the one who seeks to be fully informed and tries his best to engage objectively and rationally with the evidence will, in the long run, come to find Christianity to be true and well supported. Now, in regards to the problem of evil, I would grant that the problem of evil contributes some evidence for atheism over theism. But I think it's easy to overestimate how potent the evidence for atheism is from the problem of evil. For example, instances of evil in the world are not epistemically independent of each other. They're epistemically dependent. So, for instance, if we suppose that God has a morally sufficient justification for permitting one instance of suffering in the world, however unexpected, it's quite reasonable to suppose that he has a similar morally sufficient justification for permitting a second instance of evil, or a third, and so forth. And so the evidential value of each successive instance of evil in the world actually depreciates. It's a problem of diminishing returns when multiplying examples. You can't just keep multiplying examples indefinitely and expect the case to continue to grow in strength. By contrast, though, with the case for theism, and indeed Christianity more particularly, we don't just have lots of examples of the same thing. We have extensive evidence spanning multiple disciplines, multiple kinds of evidence, which all point convergently in the direction of theism, and indeed Christianity in particular. There's also the problem of evidential entanglement, which is to say that the problem of evil and suffering at its core presupposes as a precondition the existence of conscious sentient experience. And this would also apply, of course, to the problem of animal suffering. Animal suffering is a problem, I think, both for the theistic view as well as for the naturalistic view, because there's nothing in naturalism that predicts conscious sentient experience, which is a precondition of suffering. Consciousness, as Richard Swinburne has shown, is much more probable, much more likely on the supposition of theism than on the supposition of naturalism. And therefore, evil and suffering is highly unexpected, highly surprising, whether you're a theist or whether you're an atheist. Furthermore, the problem of evil has finite evidential value, as I think Alex would agree. So if a certain evidential threshold confirmation of theism is successfully satisfied, that provides an indirect basis for supposing that God has some morally sufficient justification for the instances of apparently gratuitous suffering in the world, even if that explanation presently eludes us. As for menial suffering that Alex alluded to, I would argue that a universe that behaves in a regular and predictable and intelligible way is good, especially in the context of eternity. Intuitively, it's I would argue intrinsically good, and it's good to accentuate the moral arena in which we find ourselves from God's perspective. And the enterprise of science is good, which supposes a regular, predictable, intelligible pattern to the world. And so it's therefore unclear that there exist possible universes which unfold so elegantly in accordance with scientifically intelligible laws, which do not also result in occasional harm to creatures born into it. Let's see. I am almost out of time, so I will close there, and I'll pick up there in this next rebuttal. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. McLatchie. And I'll turn it over to you again, Alex, for a 12-minute first rebuttal.
Thanks. Again, this is a little tricky because, of course, we're kind of there's kind of a statement, then another statement, then a response to the first statement. I want to take a minute to just respond a little bit maybe to what was in Jonathan's opening. In 1790, Immanuel Kant somewhat famously said that there will never be a Newton of the blade of grass. Isaac Newton had recently described the motion of celestial bodies with unprecedented precision, and famously expressed it in a series of groundbreaking physical laws. Yet biological matter, like a blade of grass, or indeed a human being, was for Kant something that would be immune to future scientific explanation. Biological matter is infinitely more complex and more random and more infinite than any modern Newton could even wish to explain. Of course, less than a century later, Charles Darwin came along and appeared and moved our understanding along quite considerably. Of course, he didn't even come close to answering every question of biology, but then Newton didn't come close to answering every question of physics. Still, our understanding developed. And what happened? Well, people immediately began to say, well, okay, look, maybe Darwin was something of a Newton of the origin of species, but we're still never going to get a Newton of the origin of life. In other words, the problem gets moved as our understanding increases. Now, granting for a moment Jonathan's claims about irreducible complexity of, say, DNA replication, we're simply left in a state of lack of understanding by positing that secular scientific investigation can, in principle, not adequately explain the existence and behavior of proteins in DNA replication. Jonathan's argument, it seems to me, seems to amount to something like saying that there will never be a Newton of DNA replication. Now, I'm not a biologist, as should be clear. I will not pretend to adequately understand the majesty of our internal bodily functions, but I do know that since the beginning of modern science, it's been a common story for theists to claim that although certain scientific observations once thought to be inexplicable without God can and have in fact now been explained, but not this one. This one's different. This one is special. This one requires God to explain it. We've heard this kind of claim before, and what consistently happens? Just as William Paley once said this about the complexity of living organisms, and was subsequently answered by natural selection, Jonathan is now saying that DNA replication, or saying the same of DNA replication, the only difference being that he hasn't been answered yet. Of course, Jonathan is himself doubtful of Darwinian natural selection, I believe not thinking that we share a common ancestor with all the rest of life. Is that true? Yes, which is, if I may say, I think even more of an eccentric view among biologists than, say, the view that Jesus didn't existed or didn't die on the cross, or that the disciples lied, is among historians. Of course, those are very eccentric views, but I think that is more eccentric still. But even if he disagrees with this example I've just given, I hope that you will not, and that if you do as well, you can just think of another analogous scientific development to take its place. The history of irreducible complexity specifically is a bit of a patchy one. We've heard that it was coined by Michael Behe, who has offered himself numerous examples of irreducibly complex structures, some of which have actually been subsequently shown, it seems, to be, in fact, reducible. One example is the process of blood clotting cascades, which it was suggested by Behe to involve a number of factors which independently could serve no evolutionary purpose. In other words, all the parts are necessary and cannot be reduced. But one of the very factors cited by Behe himself, a plasma protein called factor 12, was later shown to be absent in whales, demonstrating that it is not in fact essential for blood clotting, and proving Behe wrong on at least this point. Indeed, even Behe's analogous example of a mousetrap has been shown on numerous occasions to be at least partly reducible. You can Google John McDonald's demonstration of how, in principle, a mousetrap might work with only 4 parts rather than 5, and then 3, and then 2, and he even offers a suggestion of how a spring alone might be adapted to work as a mousetrap. Not a very good one, of course, but a mousetrap nonetheless. Now, Jonathan's example, as he said, is different, because DNA replication is the very basis of biological replication itself. I hope you're not expecting me to provide a biological hypothesis for it right now, because I cannot. But I must say that I'm left rather unconvinced that now, finally, we found something that is actually immune to future secular scientific explanation, even if it is immune to explanation by natural selection, which I'm not even sure whether it is or not. Consider the progress that we've made in our scientific understanding since Immanuel Kant claimed that we would never understand fully biological life. Of course, we're not even close to there yet, as it were, but we're constantly and demonstrably moving in that direction. Consider, by contrast, the progress that has been made by theology, not just since the time of Kant, but since the time of Jesus Christ himself, in explaining any of the problems that I raised in my opening statement. If there are elements of our universe without a sufficient scientific explanation, history informs us that we've been in this situation before and many times managed to overcome it. But the same is not true of my case. Where there are elements of our universe without a sufficient theological explanation, like suffering or hiddenness, history causes us instead to expect complete stagnancy. We have no analogous stories to the presentation and disproving of examples of irreducible complexity, or the progress of Newton to Einstein or Paley to Darwin. We're still today exactly where we started, with as much of an account for suffering and hiddenness than was available to Plato and the ancients. Put it this way, right? Answer honestly. If you were to look into a time machine and you saw somebody watching the video of this very discussion in the future, in about 100 years' time, let's say, would you be surprised to see one of them watching Jonathan's statement saying, would you believe it? They hadn't solved the problem of DNA replication yet. Seems at least plausible. It's easy enough to imagine, right? But it would be surprising indeed, don't you think, if you were to look into that time machine and they said, those same people were to say something like, of my case, would you believe it? They hadn't solved the problem of evil yet, or the problem of divine hiddenness. It seems infinitely less plausible. Intuitively, it feels like far more likely that the naturalist will one day be able to explain and account for DNA replication than that the theist will ever be able to account for suffering or hiddenness. Indeed, it's usually expected that the theist will never be able to offer such an account. Jonathan also mentioned the resurrection, and he said that there are only 3 explanations for the accounts of the resurrection, that the disciples were lied, that they lied, that they were mistaken, or that they were incorrect. I would add to this suggestion a 4th, which is that the reports themselves were inaccurately put down into our records, but I think Jonathan more or less addressed that by saying that the gospel writers were fairly scrupulous, and so I think implicitly trying to undermine that example. Now, I admit that some of the hypotheses for explaining what happened on Easter morning are a little bit tenuous. There have been theories that have been suggested and generally rejected by certainly most biblical scholars. For example, the idea that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen. These kinds of things are usually disproved with fairly intuitive points. That is to say, it seems ridiculous to suggest that Jesus didn't die on the cross. The Romans did know how to kill people, after all. And there would have been various other reasons, which I won't go into now for the sake of time, but I'm sure you're familiar with such a response. But you have to understand the context in which this conversation is taking place. If we assume theism is true, if we assume the existence of a God, then it may be that of all the plausible explanations, of all the possible explanations, the best one is that he rose Jesus from the dead. But in a conversation seeking to establish the very truth of theism, we must start agnostic on that position and then ask, sure, it's highly implausible that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, or that his body was stolen, or that the disciples were lying, or that the disciples were mistaken, or that the disciples were simply incorrect. But doesn't it seem less plausible yet to suggest that a man rose from the dead? To the naturalist, you can understand why this would seem like quite a leap, unless you've already assumed theism, making the suggestion that this God might have risen Jesus from the dead more plausible than these other explanations. Thinking about the evidence for the resurrection is a complicated topic, but it seems strange to me, for example, that the earliest gospel that we have, the earliest account of Jesus' death, contains no resurrection appearances at all. I'll say that again. The earliest gospel contains no post-resurrection appearances of Jesus Christ. What the end of Mark's gospel does say is that there's essentially a prediction. That is, we're told by an angel or presumed angel, that Jesus has gone ahead to Galilee, and you should expect to find him there. And this is where the original manuscript of Mark's gospel ends. Matthew, the next earliest gospel, does contain two appearances, one to the women who visited the tomb on the way to tell the disciples, and then a vision in line with the prediction made in Mark. Now, of course, if this was being somehow forged or something, it seems quite strange, or at least plausible, that this addition could have been made using Mark as a source, which everyone agrees that Matthew does. Luke, later still, contains even more appearances, including like the road to Emmaus. And then John's Gospel, even later still, provides more accounts of appearances, including doubting Thomas, and some other famous examples. I find it a little strange, then, that the further away we get from the origin of the source, the more appearances we see. The earliest Gospel contains no resurrection appearances. The second earliest Gospel does contain one group appearance, but it's exactly in line with what was predicted at the end of Mark. Anyway, this seems a little strange to me. Now, I won't suggest that I could confidently say that these Gospels were forged, or that the writers were mistaken, or that somebody was lying, or that something got miscommunicated. All I'll say is that for the naturalist, these conclusions seem a lot more plausible than the idea that a man might have risen from the dead. I think that's all I've got time for, but hopefully we can speak about St. Paul in a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. We'll now start our second round of rebuttals. These will be slightly shorter at 6 minutes. And just a reminder that following this, we'll have a time of cross-examination followed by an open time of Q&A. So be preparing your questions. Dr. McLatchie, I'll turn it over to you for 6 minutes.
All right, well, thank you, Alex. So let's begin with the first point. So he says that my argument essentially amounts to a God of the gaps argument. We can't explain something like DNA replication, so we'll just plug in God, and as science progresses and advances, the argument has to shrink with each new development, and we are finding smaller and smaller gaps to plug God into. I disagree with this argument. I think that this is not a God of the gaps argument based on what we don't know about the cause and effect structure of the world. Rather, it's based on what we do know about the cause and effect structure of the world, namely that information-rich systems are habitually associated with conscious activity. In every other realm of experience, when we find information content, whether it's in the form of a hieroglyphic inscription or paragraphs in a book or computer programming script or whatever it happens to be, there's a habitual association between information content and intelligence. And so when we find information content in the DNA molecule, the discovery of that information content is rendered more likely on the supposition of theism than it would be on its falsehood. And so it tends to confirm the theistic hypothesis. It tends to confirm the design hypothesis. He says that science has had a track record of success in discovering natural explanations for natural phenomena and things that were, it's often said that we often find natural explanations for things that were once thought to be supernatural, but we don't have any examples of the contrary, where you have supernatural explanations explaining things that were once thought to be explained naturally. And I would want to challenge this argument by pointing out that there are modern discoveries in science which actually have increased the credibility of theism relative to what it was before. For example, in the 20th century, you have the Big Bang cosmology, which displaced the prior model, which was the steady state model, which maintained that the universe were essentially static and eternal. And that sits far more comfortably on a naturalistic scenario. In fact, the Big Bang in the 20th century was opposed by many for its profoundly theistic metaphysical implications. And yet the Big Bang enjoys strong scientific support and from multiple lines of evidence. And therefore, we have an example of evidence that has come to light in view of modern science that increases the credibility of theism, because the eternal universe sits far more comfortably on a naturalistic worldview, and so demonstrating the universe had a beginning raises the probability of theism relative to what it would have been otherwise. He says that my skepticism of evolution is more eccentric than Jesus' mythicism in historiography. I would beg to differ with this. I contend that there are. I think I could probably count the scholars with PhDs in relevant subjects who are Jesus mythicists on perhaps one hand. I can give you thousands upon thousands of critics of Darwinism and advocates of intelligent design. Read, for example, the Descent from Darwin list, which lists over 1,000 examples of scientists who are skeptical of the sufficiency of Darwinian mechanisms to account for the complexity of life. Okay, so he says that Behe was wrong about the factor involved in blood clotting that's absent in whales. So Miller actually doesn't refute Behe's argument. I'm afraid Alex is just misinformed here. So Ken Miller, who's from Brown University, I think he's now retired, he gave evidence that some vertebrates, like dolphins and jawed fish, lack certain components that are involved in the intrinsic pathway, and that are found in land-dwelling vertebrates. And what he didn't acknowledge is that land-dwelling vertebrates and jawed fish and water-dwelling mammals, such as whales, dolphins, still have the extrinsic pathway intact, as well as everything after the point where the intrinsic and extrinsic pathways combine in land-dwelling vertebrates. So in other words, the jawed fish and dolphins still have the factors in the blood clotting cascade that were said by Behe in his book Darwin's Black Box to be irreducibly complex, which he said he was only addressing those after the fork, after the split. So they even have the factors on the blood clotting cascade's extrinsic pathway. The only factors that appear to be missing are the portions on the intrinsic pathway. And so since Behe's argument didn't include those factors on the intrinsic pathway, it only dealt with factors shared by jawed fish and water-dwelling mammals and land-dwelling vertebrates, Miller's argument, I'm afraid, doesn't refute Behe's argument. His objection doesn't refute Behe's argument at all. He says that so Alex said that, he said that we're more likely to solve the DNA replication problem than the suffering or hiddenness problem. I think that the more that we study the origins of life, and the more that we study the origins of these systems, the more intractable Darwinian naturalistic type explanations actually appear to be. The gaps, I would contend, are actually growing, not shrinking, when it comes to evolutionary explanations of these complex molecular machines. In terms of the resurrection, he says that there's a fourth alternative. The reports themselves were inaccurately given. I could talk for many hours on this subject, but I don't have time at this point. He says naturalistic explanations are almost more probable than the hypothesis of a miracle. The miracle has a very low intrinsic probability, and we need to assume theism first. Okay, I'm going to challenge my opponent this evening to demonstrate the low intrinsic probability of the special miracles that we find in the New Testament. And what's the basis, what's the justification for assuming them to be rare? If we say that it's because they noticeably deviate from the normal course of nature, that's exactly what you would expect on the supposition that God has used miracles as authenticating signs in history. And so the fact that they are, in fact, noticeably deviating from the normal course of nature can't be used as a defeater of miracles. And there's a lot more to say there, but my time is up, so I will conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McLatchie. And Alex, I'll invite you up for one more 6-minute speech.
Okay. Thanks again, Jonathan. You can imagine it's quite difficult to try to pull everything together on the fly, but we'll see what we can see what we can do here. On divine hiddenness, Jonathan said that we shouldn't expect God to provide overwhelming evidence to everybody, just perfectly adequate evidence, and at one point even implied that for a lot of people they won't be provided with adequate evidence at all, but rather in a sort of on like a Molinist account, God will know what they would have done had they been provided with that evidence, and this is how we can explain that they're not damned. I found it confusing then that Jonathan went on to reference the Psalms in Romans 1, with the Psalms saying that the heavens and earth declare the glory of God immediately, and Romans 1 going as far as to say, it's something often quoted, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. The implication by Paul, at least, seems to be that actually people are without excuse upon investigation of the world around them in thinking that there isn't sufficient evidence for God's existence. It seems that the appeal there to Romans 1 and the assertion that God may not provide adequate evidence to everybody, and at least not overwhelming evidence to most people, even everybody, seem to contradict each other. It's possible that I've just misunderstood Jonathan there, though, of course, misunderstood. Jonathan also said that menial suffering can be explained by the uniformity of laws, which are a good thing. And I agree that these are a useful thing if you're designing a universe, to have uniform laws that keep working regardless of what happens. But of course, granting that these laws would require instances of menial suffering, which is already questionable for an omnipotent God, but let's just grant it, all this would require is my ability to sometimes stub my toe on a rock, because that's in accordance with the various laws and the location of physical objects. It would not require that I have the experience of being harmed by it. This is not something that would be required. Of course, on naturalism, suffering as a result of that kind of experience would be expected, because that's the very reason it evolved, is to help us to avoid such things, because it's a harmful experience. On a theistic paradigm, we might expect that God would give us a slightly more painless warning that we shouldn't be doing these kinds of things again. Jonathan also, I think, slightly misunderstood my point, forgivably though, because I made it rather briefly, which is when I said that science has made progress in explaining natural phenomena, and then I said that it hasn't made any progress, or even theology hasn't made any progress in addressing hiddenness and the problem of evil. I, of course, think that science has made much progress on certain points that might be thought to establish theism, such as the Big Bang. But my point was not that science has not made any progress on establishing theism, rather that whilst the things that I'm asking, the things that Jonathan is asking to be explained, including like DNA replication, we can expect from a historical analysis that one day my side of the camp, as it were, the people who think that everything in the universe can at least potentially be explained, will eventually do so. But on the exact reverse, which is something like hiddenness or the problem of evil being explained by Jonathan's side of the camp, that is the theologian, we should expect stagnancy. How much time do I have? 2.5 minutes. Okay. There are a few other little things that I would quibble on, but they're not exactly they're not really sufficient to totally undermine Jonathan's case. For instance, it's often said that the fact that women discovered the empty tomb is evidence in the favour of the resurrection, because of course why would any forgery have women discovering the empty tomb when their testimony is not worth very much? Of course, in not all of the accounts, but most of the accounts, one of the first things that the women do after discovering the empty tomb is run and tell the men, who are then reported to go and check, because they don't believe the women, so they then go and check and confirm that actually, yes, the tomb is in fact empty. So I think that this maybe isn't as strong as it's been suggested. Jonathan said that people are judged on the light that they have rejected, rather than some kind of, let's say, objective standard. He quoted Richard Dawkins in saying that even the second coming of Jesus would not change his mind. I think this just can be added to, shall we say, a cumulative case as to why Richard Dawkins shouldn't be taken seriously as a philosopher or theologian. I thought it might be worth just saying what I think might change my mind, which, if I didn't make it clear, I don't think that if I am going to become a Christian, it's most likely going to be through some form of syllogism. I don't expect, in other words, I think it would be quite strange for God to choose to reveal himself at the bottom of a microscope, that I kind of try everything I can, and then I read one book somewhere and see one syllogism, or look in a microscope and see one biological structure that makes me go, aha, I see him. I think it would be something like a religious experience, and the problem of divine hiddenness is why such an experience seems to have been not granted to me yet. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Alex. We'll now have a time of cross-examination where the debaters will have an opportunity to ask each other questions and hear their responses. So I'll invite you both to join me over here at the table. Just got this laptop. All right, so yes, we'll have Dr. McLatchie go first, and we'll have 10 minutes to ask Alex questions, and then we'll repeat the favor.
All right.
So go ahead.
Excellent. So thanks, Alex, for your presentation and your rebuttals. Let's start by the resurrection, because I didn't really get to touch on that much in my last rebuttal. You mentioned that the earliest gospel doesn't have any resurrection appearances, and as you acknowledged,
Yes.
It says in Mark 16, the angels tell the disciples to go and tells the woman to go tell the disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. So there is a implication that there's going to be appearances. Also, 1 Corinthians 15, which is an earlier account, does mention more appearances than any of the Gospels.
500.
Yeah.
Of course, I've always found that quite strange, the reference by Paul there to the appearance to more than 500. This is, I believe, the only account of such an event happening. I wonder kind of who these 500 are, if they ever thought to write anything down, if there's any other account of 500 people having seen this kind of stuff. We're not sure why it is that Paul knows this is the case. He doesn't give an account of where he got this information. It seems to me at least plausibly something that could be false, right? It's not, in other words, it's not like extremely well established that Jesus did appear to a group of 500 people.
No, I agree with you. That I don't think the appearance of the 500 in 1 Corinthians 15 is a strong evidential value. It's not a major line of argument for me. I'm just challenging your assertion that there's a developmental trajectory.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, which is fine, of course. You recognise that does exist within the Gospels. The only exception being here one reference by Paul in a letter, which, of course, we've got kind of no actual narration of the appearance. We've just got somebody saying that he's essentially heard that this is something that Jesus had done. Our earliest accounts of an actual narration of Jesus appearing to people don't exist in our earlier sources, except, of course, to the appearance to Paul on the road to Damascus, which would be an example of a group hallucination. But funnily enough, I find this quite interesting, is that it's often said that, well, the disciples couldn't have been essentially hallucinating because of the fact of group appearances. You don't get group hallucinations. But the only early account that we have of a group hallucination, that is the appearance to Paul and his travelling companions, is one in which the companions don't also see the appearance. It's just Paul. Which I find quite strange. So I'm dubious of
But
this.
they do have sensory perceptions of the encounter. But be that as it may, I did want to ask about, because coming back to your developmental scenario, Mark, we don't know what he would have gone on to say, because he finishes his account very abruptly. Scholars debate over whether Mark is complete. He intended to finish there, or whether he actually had an ending that subsequently got lost from verse 9 and following. So we don't really know what Mark would have said. And then Matthew and Luke are written approximately around the same time, and Luke doesn't seem to be literally dependent upon Matthew. So really your only data points are Matthew and Luke and John in terms of your developmental trajectory.
Sure, but of course the lack of the appearance narrative in Mark is part of that trajectory. Of course, this could be explained partly by that trajectory, or perhaps by the fact that he did write it and it got lost, or he just decided not to write it, of course. But I'm just kind of using the evidence that's being presented to me here, which are 4 Gospels, the first of which contains no resurrection appearances. And I'm thinking, what might explain the fact that as time goes on, the fancifulness of the stories seems to increase. Indeed, ending in John, the final edition, with the addition of Doubting Thomas, which seems to be a moral lesson against requiring evidence for belief. Of course, after Thomas touches the wounds of Jesus, Jesus says that it's, he now believes, but blessed are those who believe without seeing. He believes because he's seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. So what we get is the further away we get from the actual events that are being reported, the more fanciful the stories, culminating in a story that has a moral lesson advising people that they shouldn't desire to believe on the basis of evidence. This seems to me strange.
So that's not what John's saying there at all. In fact, in the very same chapter, he goes on to say, John, the author, goes on to say that these things are written that you might believe that he is the Christ and thus have life in his name. In terms of what he says in verse 29 to Thomas, he's chiding Thomas for not having believed in sufficient evidence because he had the testimony of the other apostles. He'd been with Jesus throughout his ministry and observed the miracles and so forth.
Of course, John is writing at the end of John why he wrote his gospel, but
right.
I'm quoting the words of Jesus, right? So there's kind of there's a disanalogy here, or a difference here, which is that Jesus is saying, you believe because you've seen, blessed are those who believe without seeing. It's then John who says, oh, but I decided to write this down so that people will come to believe. That it's kind of 2 separate sources there.
Sure. So, first of all, I gave an explanation for an interpretation of what I think Jesus is saying. And secondly, Jesus, if you look elsewhere, for example, in Matthew 11, when John the Baptist sends disciples to Jesus, are we the one we're expecting, or should we wait for another? He says, well, go back to John, tell him what you hear and see. But he talks about the miracles that he's been performing. Right? He talks about the sign of Jonah and his resurrection as being evidence for his incarnation and divine identity.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Is there like a question?
Yeah, so I'm objecting to that particular point that Jesus does seem to affirm approaching this topic evidentially.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay. That would be fine. I'd be fine to just kind of drop that point about John, but I'm not really sure if we should.
Okay.
It seems to me that seems to be the most natural reading of Doubting Thomas. You're saying that the story should in fact be interpreted as Jesus basically saying, you have believed because you've seen a lot of evidence. Blessed are those who believe having seen sufficient evidence, or something like this?
Yeah, so Thomas was discontent with having sufficient evidence, that he should have believed on the basis of what he already had. And God doesn't take well to people not believing when they've already got sufficient evidence.
Right, I see. That might be plausible. I'm happy to look into it.
I did want to ask you, though, about your low intrinsic probability of miracles.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So can you justify why you come to that conclusion?
I guess the point that I was kind of trying to make there was to say that in the context of this discussion, do you expect a naturalist to take as seriously the hypothesis that a man rose from the dead as he should take the hypothesis that, say, Jesus didn't die or something? Like, in other words, like, I suppose you're not surprised that somebody would not do that, but you're saying that they're being kind of irrational in doing so.
Correct.
Because in assuming that something like a miracle would have a lower intrinsic probability.
Exactly. So I'm interested in what your justification is for assigning such an intrinsically low probability to miracles.
Well, wouldn't you say, like as you said, the fact that this doesn't happen elsewhere would not be a good response because that's what we'd actually want. This is
that's what
God
we'd expect.
Is trying to do. He's trying to put forward a unique event. Could not the same be said that the reason why the resurrection is a powerful vindication of Jesus' message is because it has a low probability of occurring, and so that makes it miraculous that God did it, right? Like, it seems to me that the intuitive force of saying, isn't it amazing that Jesus rising from the dead, isn't it amazing that happened and this vindicates his message, is because of the fact that we should expect this to be so improbable that if it really did happen, this provides strong evidence. And I also wonder if you think that it would provide the same evidence as any other miracle. That is, I don't know why it is that rising from the dead specifically, except maybe the fact that he predicted it, would be any more of indication of his divinity than his ability to turn water into wine. If there was an instance of him having predicted that he would go on to do that and then did that, this seems equally miraculous. This is I don't see why the resurrection in particular would offer a vindication.
Sure. So for a number. Okay, so I'm trying to formulate a question. So Isaiah 53:10, for example, speaks about the resurrection in the context of messianic prophecy. Jesus himself says that the resurrection will be the vindication of his messianic divine self-claims. And so it's very surprising if God raises Jesus from the dead if he's a false Messiah, for example, right?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that does make sense. Yeah. I think that answers it quite well, I think.
Would you also be amenable to the argument that you can bring other arguments to bear independently on Jesus' messianic and divine identity, such as some of the arguments I listed briefly, the trilemma, messianic prophecy, the conversion of Paul, etc., that would be relevant to establishing the prior probability in Jesus' case specifically.
I think you could do, but I don't think that it's been very well done. I don't think the examples that you say, like the trilemma, I don't think that's like good evidence of Jesus' divinity, nor do I think the conversion of St. Paul is particularly strong evidence of Jesus' divinity. I wonder, I know there's only kind of a minute left of your time, but what are the specificities about Paul's conversion that you think bear on the divinity of Jesus?
Sure. I'm trying to formulate questions. This is my question time, so I'm rather than give a statement.
Well, I can ask
sure.
you on the other time if you have anything else you want to say now.
Sure. Okay, so in terms of the argument for intelligent design, would you acknowledge that it's not a God of the gaps argument, that is actually a positive argument?
This is something I was going to ask you about. You said that it's not a God of the gaps argument because it's based on what we do know, and I forget exactly how you argued that case. If you could maybe just do it again briefly.
Yeah, so it's basically that there's a habitual association between information and conscious activity.
Right. Yeah. So I would say, for example, imagine somebody like pre-Newton or something, looking at the orbits of the planets and saying, like, I have absolutely no idea how they're up there, why they're spinning in the way that they're spinning. It must be God. Would you say that is a God of the gaps argument? Mm-hmm. But suppose somebody then said to you, this isn't a God of the gaps argument. This is actually based on what I do know, not what I don't know, which is that there's a habitual association between things that we see moving, that don't stop moving, generally have some kind of agent causing them to continue moving. And so I say that the same thing must be true of the orbs moving in the sky. That doesn't seem to not make it a God of the gaps argument. That seems like just a way of kind of dressing it up.
Okay. All right, that's all we have time for on this section, so we'll flip the script, and Alex, you can go ahead and ask Dr. McLatchie.
Okay. I guess I can restate a question that I asked you directly in my opening statement, which is, are you troubled by the fact that a person's place of birth is a statistically reliable indicator of their likelihood of being saved?
Great question. So I with divine hiddenness, including the geographical predictability of religious belief, I trust the goodness of God that he will get the relevant information to people that need it. And if someone genuinely goes through their life and dies in a state of non-resistant non-belief, I trust in God's goodness and his mercy, and so I believe that he will give them some sort of opportunity. He will have some sort of arrangement worked out there. I'm familiar with also many examples of Muslims who have converted because Isa appeared to them in a dream. I know someone in my own circle of contacts that this happened to and converted to Christianity without any Christian background or much influence in that regard.
I wonder how you think this squares with something like Romans 1, which says that, which seems to imply at the very least, that God has provided sufficient evidence for everybody such that they are without excuse. In other words, do you think there is such thing as a non-resistant non-believer, truly? Or can be such a thing?
In regards to Romans 1, I actually think that I don't see that as universally applicable, what's said in Romans 1. I see that as applied to a certain contingent of people.
So who would it be applied to? The Corinthians?
So he's referring to certain individuals to whom this applies. I don't think he's...
So you don't think that it applies to everybody?
Correct.
Okay, that's fine. That would sort out that problem. I also want to talk about God of the gaps, but we've already done that. Do you think that God has good reason not to overwhelm us with evidence of his existence? This is another thing that you were hinting at.
I do, actually. So, as I said in my opening statement, or in my rebuttal, I think that this life is a probation. We live in a moral choice arena where we mold and shape our character, engaging with each other and engaging in moral decision making. And if God were constantly at the forefront of our awareness, so that he was always right in front of us, right, then I think that would undermine the possibility of this life serving as a probation, because we would always be immediately conscious of God knowing our thoughts and knowing exactly what we were up to. Whereas if God strikes the right balance between hiddenness and providing sufficient evidence for those that seek him, he actually sets up the world, I think, in an optimal way so as to not go against our free will.
Yeah, I agree. This can be free will. I'd say is maybe a slightly different point. There are two things to pull out of this. The first is to say, okay, maybe God wants us to kind of be in a moral arena, making decisions about how to treat each other, and if he was constantly over our shoulder, as it were, it'd be like kind of your parents always being there, and that's the reason you're not stealing from the cookie jar. Right. Much rather you learn to not steal from the cookie jar, even when your parents kind of aren't looking over your shoulder. But of course, the child will have had at least one experience in their life that does overwhelmingly indicate that their parents exist. And that doesn't require that the parents be present in all of their lives at all of the time, constantly looking over everything that they do, only that at least once in their life they've been provided with such overwhelming evidence. In other words, I don't think you could make the same response to somebody who says, well, yeah, of course, I understand at the very least why it might be the case that God wouldn't want to constantly be right in front of our faces. That might interrupt some of our activities. But this doesn't seem to prevent him from providing one such example once in my life that allows me to know that he is in fact there, and then lets me live the rest of my life without his constant presence, engaging in a moral arena. I don't see why that would be a problem. Also, if you think that kind of maybe the directness of God would impinge upon our free will, not just, I wonder if you just mean kind of the free will to treat other people morally, or if you would include the free will to kind of come to love God, because I don't know if that's what you were kind of hinting at there.
No, I was talking about the making moral decisions in this life, because this life is a probation, and so this life is a test, and so God strikes this balance between providing sufficient evidence and also. Okay,
so then what about the objection that God could provide such overwhelming or even slightly more than adequate, let's say, evidence of his existence to everybody once in their lives, but seemingly fails to do so?
I'm not convinced that there is such a thing as a long-term non-resistant non-believer. So if someone is a non-resistant non-believer at, say, time t, then it could well be the case that God's just not finished with them yet.
But I'm saying, do you think you're committed to this view? Because I'm saying that the problem is that God doesn't provide at least one example of his kind of overwhelming presence, just once, to allow a person to know that he's there. And then lives the rest of their life without his immediate presence. You seem to be responding to that by saying that the way to get around that objection is to suggest that if you haven't had that experience yet, you will do. So are you saying with like a bit more confidence that this is actually your response to that problem? You expect that someone like me who hasn't had such an experience, if I keep looking, will have that experience?
Right. As I said, I think that one of the forms that the probation in this life can take is to see whether one is willing to invest the time to conduct the sort of inquiry that will give one a fair assessment of the available evidence.
So given that then, if there is one example, do you think, in other words, there is no example of somebody who is a truly non-resistant non-believer for the entirety of their lives? In other words, if somebody were to die having spent their entire life claiming to be openly searching for the existence of God as honestly as they can, and never has such an experience until the day they die, would you be committed to the view that they must be lying or mistaken, and that they weren't actually as honest as they claim to be?
So I don't rule out that. So there can be examples, perhaps, say someone, for example, in an Amazonian tribesman, for example, who's never had access to the gospel or something like that. Then I think that God will judge them on the basis of the light that they've been given. And I trust in the goodness of God that he has some arrangement in place for such individuals.
I'm talking about people who are seeking God, have heard of the Gospels, are basically aware of the conversation that we're having, and they say, okay, well, maybe it's just because I need to keep honestly searching. They do that until the very day they die. They never have such an experience. Have they done something wrong?
No. So, as I said, I think if someone genuinely is a non-resistant non-believer throughout the course of their entire lives, I think that God will have some sort of arrangement.
Then it would be like the tribesman.
Yeah. But it's very difficult without, because the only person that I have complete biographical knowledge of is myself.
Quite right.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know how God has been dealing in the lives of other people other than myself.
Okay, 3 minutes. I'd like to talk about Paul, if we can. I tried to ask a moment ago what it is you think about the conversion of Paul specifically that bears on the divinity of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, very quickly then. So if we read the book of Acts, chapter 9, I would argue that Acts was written by a traveling companion of Paul, and I think that we can show with a high level of confidence that the account in Acts 9 concerning Paul's conversion actually most likely reflects Paul's
I'm willing to grant that.
Yeah. It seems to me that Paul is sincere in his conviction that Christ appeared to him on the road to Damascus. And that's clear from the way that Paul converts to Christianity against his own self-interest.
The first thing, okay, so there's the point about self-interest and there's the point about him appearing to Paul. Sometimes the conversation goes something like this. Somebody will say that, well, maybe the disciples were just lying.
Yep.
And one response to this is to say, well, this can't be the case because Jesus actually occurred to some people, which included his enemies, such as Paul.
Right.
But you recognize that the appearance to Paul is nothing like the kinds of appearances that are described at the ends of the Gospels.
Sure.
That is, it's not a physical Jesus, there's not a man who walks up to Paul, but rather just a bright light and a voice that he hears.
But notice that there is a sensory experience that that it has upon his traveling companions.
Yes.
And also notice that he's blinded, he's healed by Ananias.
Yeah, there's an interesting
Yep.
study about that actually, in terms of like somebody having an epileptic fit and its ability to cause temporary blindness. It's actually remarkably similar to the experience of Paul. And of course the other his companions are said to have kind of heard what was said. It's possible that was reported because like Paul might have just told them or something like this. It's at least plausible. They certainly didn't see the vision that Paul saw. Of course, there's also this point about the fact that Paul was a persecutor. So why would he suddenly sort of start believing in Jesus on the basis of this appearance? I think it's quite easy to say or to suggest that somebody who's engaged in the persecution of Christians would have something like a kind of guilt-driven appearance of Christ. You could make an analogy, for instance, to a lot of vegans will tell you that one of the reasons that maybe they went vegan, I've heard this a few times, is that they used to eat meat all the time, and they were watching factory farm footage, they just didn't really care, and then they had this dream where a cow appears to them and says, Jonathan, why are you persecuting me? And they say, why are you forcing me into a gas chamber? And then they wake up and they go, oh my gosh, and from that day onwards they become a vegan. Now I could say that, well, the fact that somebody just had this vision, and especially if they had it in the daytime and with a blinding flash of light and they thought it was kind of not a dream, in other words, I could say that their sudden conversion to veganism is best explained by the undeniable truth of veganism. Or I could say that it's because they were feeling guilty about what they've just done. And if Paul has just overseen the stoning of, The stoning of Stephen,
yeah.
thank you. The stoning of Stephen, he's watched this take place. He goes on a long walk with lots of time to think to himself. Don't you think it's not too surprising that he might have something like an experience driven by guilt, and that would explain why a persecutor becomes a Christian, not the truth of Christianity.
Short response,
Okay.
yes.
Briefly, that's a possibility, but is it probable? So, for example, Paul describes in Philippians 3, 4-6, he says, if anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness, under the law, blameless. He seems quite content in his former ways of Judaism. Also, in regards to guilt-based conversion. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders says that women are 5 to 1 times more likely to experience conversion psychosis. Also, adolescents, military persons, and battle, people of low economic status, and those with a low IQ are also more likely prone to experience this phenomenon, and Paul doesn't seem to fit that reference class.
Thank you. That's all we have time for. Sorry.
Cool.
All right, so I'd just like to take a moment to thank both of you for a really engaging discussion and your civility and kindness toward each other. I really appreciate it. So we're going to take some time now to open the floor for questions. I think the format, we will take 3 in-house questions. Yes, go ahead. We'll take 3 in-house questions first. So for those of you on YouTube joining us live, you're welcome to submit questions starting now, and I will start with the first, whatever we have time for. So we'll take 3 in-house questions, and then I'll go every other if we have more in-house between YouTube Live and the in-house questions. So for those of you who are here in person, you can make your way to the microphone and ask a question. Just form a line, and you may direct it to either speaker. Yeah.
But can I just say, by the way, that I'm filming questions for uploading the debate to the YouTube channel, but if anybody wishes not to be in it, just come and let me know.
Go ahead, and there's a mic set up there. Yeah.
Thank you, Alex, for your openness about your search for God. I really liked how you shared that. Now, I have 2 questions, very similar to one another. So, on divine hiddenness, is that lack of religious experience or lack of convincing like arguments, like all the arguments that Jonathan gives? Like, would you define lack of the divine hiddenness as lack of religious experience or lack of arguments? And for yourself, you spoke of your own search for God. Was that the lack of convincing arguments, or was that lack of religious experience for you?
Yeah, thank you. That's a useful question. I think it may be both. As I said, I would imagine that if there were going to be something that would be able to convince me, even if just based on my what I've heard from conversion stories, it doesn't tend to be that somebody hears a new argument and then kind of drops to their knees and accepts Christianity. But you hear of overwhelming religious experiences, a bit like St. Paul's, which do that. In fact, almost all of the gospel accounts of people coming to sort of follow Christ is generally based on some form of experience. They see a miracle performed, Paul sees a blinding light, this kind of thing. There might be a message in there, in fact, that the Christian should expect to be convinced to follow Christ, not by argumentation, but rather by the things that they experience. So I would predict that that would be the case. Although I do also think that it is strange, suspicious, that I find what has been described as like an avalanche of evidence as simply unconvincing, and in such a way that I think I can at least explain why I think that, even if I'm mistaken. There's a kind of question that can be asked if somebody says, someone like Jonathan says, look, here's a piece of evidence, here's another piece of evidence, here's another piece of evidence, and why are you not a Christian? Why are you not convinced by this? To which I would say, good question. That itself seems to be a potential objection taking the form of divine hiddenness, which is that we have the same evidence on the table in front of us, and yet I guess I'm just made of such a psychological constitution that for whatever reason, even if I'm honestly mistaken, I don't find it convincing. But Jonathan does. Lucky him, I guess. Now he gets to inherit eternal glory, and I don't. In other words, it doesn't seem to be my fault. So I think that kind of not being convinced after an honest engagement with various arguments is a good basis for the divine hiddenness problem. But in my own personal experience, I would predict that it's probably the lack of experience that most motivates me to be suspicious of the existence of God.
So do you think a religious experience would help you see the arguments differently?
Now, there's a really interesting question. In fact, Jonathan and I were talking about this a little bit last night, although in reverse, which is like, is it the case that if I were to have a religious experience and then I re-evaluated the arguments, would I find them more convincing? Well, that may be true, actually. I'd be surprised if that weren't the case. But to me, that just shows God surely would know that people are more likely to be convinced by a particular line of reasoning if they have an experience. And so kind of being lambasted for not accepting the convincingness of an argument, if that's maybe because of the fact that I haven't had the kind of experience that would make me take it seriously, that just makes it worse, I think, because then you can ask, well, isn't it even more unfair that I've been restricted such an experience that it's even going to affect the way that I engage in conversations like this? So if that were the case, then great, I hope such an experience will come my way, but I'd see it in itself as a problem.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Just actually, I'm going to make one comment before you ask your question. Sure. I saw a comment in the YouTube chat asking if we are taking YouTube questions, and yes, we are taking YouTube live questions. I will allow 3 audience in-person questions first, and then I'll get to your questions. So just hang tight.
Great. All right, my question is for you, Alex. I think when it comes to the biological argument, to go from a single cell to a complex human through unguided evolution is unlikely, but I grant that it's plausible. But to go from nothing at all to a single-celled argument seems even, a single-celled organism seems even less likely to me, even more amazing. So I'm curious what you think just about the origin of life itself as regards to a naturalist explanation.
Yeah, I agree. It's one of the most kind of amusing questions in the world. Of course, I think Jonathan would agree that if we were to say something like, well, we are just bemused at how this came about, it was probably God, that this would constitute a God of the gaps argument. There might be a way that, again, you could dress it up as to say that it's kind of more something, as Jonathan says, about what we do know, that this kind of thing doesn't happen. But the amazing thing about the origin of life is that it seems at least to only have happened once. That the fact that it only happened once and kind of doesn't happen all the time might be an example of such an argument that's not a God of the gaps variety that says that there might have been some divine intervention here, because if it happens naturally, why doesn't it happen all the time? Of course, this might equally be explained by the fact that it seems our most recent evidence suggests that life began almost immediately after the Earth formed around 4.5 billion years ago, at least in its most simple form. So maybe it had something to do with the original conditions of the Earth that don't admit now. But of course, I have no idea how life got started in the universe. And I admit that in terms of those considerations, that when you just kind of think of them in the kind of context of a theistic discussion and think, yeah, right, that does seem like a pretty good reason to think that God exists. I don't think it can be formed into an argument that isn't fallacious, but I understand the intuitive appeal. I don't know how life began in this universe, but I just put it into the box of those things which are yet to be explained. There are lots of incredible things that are yet to be explained, like the development of consciousness, for example. But yeah, I guess I don't see them as this is like a good reason to consider God's existence unless it can be put into a good argumentative form, you know?
Gotcha. Okay. Can I ask another question?
I'll go for it. Feel free to get in line so that we can see. I'll give a little bit of leeway if it doesn't seem like we're building up questions, but feel free to get in line if you have one so that we get to your question.
So I thought it was a really interesting argument to say that Paul's conversion might have been kind of a guilt-based conversion, and that kind of explains why he left his lifestyle of being a very high-status person to being persecuted. What do you think of just the other apostles, though, who didn't seem to have any guilt-based reason to follow Jesus and still gave up a lot? Even though they didn't really come from any prestigious background, they still chose to enter a life of persecution and suffering for Jesus. Why do you believe that they did this?
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and it's actually something I haven't really heard kind of put in those terms before, in terms of like not so much the disciples being willing to suffer for their beliefs, but the beginning of them following Jesus. It seems clear to me that, for instance, if it's the case that Jesus didn't actually perform any miracles, he wasn't divine, it still seems possible that he would have managed to get some people to follow him through being an extraordinarily charismatic teacher, as I think everybody would agree that he was, atheist or not. In other words, I think there are some quite plausible explanations as to why people might have followed Jesus. As you say, they didn't have like a whole lot to give up. Although I guess it's enough that it should cause a problem, right? To kind of leave your job, leave your wife, follow this man, this kind of thing. I do think that is a problem that needs to be explained. But again, if you're asking me, not already assuming the existence of a God, not assuming like the viability of the resurrection or something, here's an account of some men who heard a man, claimed to see him perform some miracles, and then decided to follow him. I don't think that the best explanation of this is going to be that God exists. Of course, as part of a cumulative case, it's a useful thing to bring up. And as I say, it is qualitatively different from Paul. But yeah, no, it's interesting. I guess I'd have to give it more thought. But I guess intuitively I would say that their originally following Jesus isn't too difficult to explain by Jesus being a charismatic, natural human being, and only human being. Their willingness to suffer and die is, I think, a separate question, which is harder to explain, but that, I think, would lend itself more to the other hypotheses that have been suggested. For instance, like, there are only 2 deaths of disciples, if I'm not mistaken, recorded in the Gospels themselves, which are the killing of James by Herod with the sword and the suicide of Judas. We have some extra-biblical evidence of the other apostles being killed. I think it's believed that sort of every apostle's death is accounted for somewhere, but there's not a whole lot of detail about the nature of exactly why they were killed and how they were killed. For instance, it's not obvious that they would have been saved if they recanted. It's possible that they were being persecuted because of what they'd done and what they'd said, and so that even if they then were sort of cowering in their knees, asking to live a life as a non-Christian, they might have been denied it. There are interesting responses to that. For instance, the Romans' ability to use someone as an example. If they said, no, Christianity isn't true, don't kill me, then maybe they would have had reason not to kill them. But at the very least, it's a fuzzy issue. I think there are a lot of things that need to be considered. I just don't think that without already assuming the existence of a God, it makes sense to best conclude from these facts that Jesus was his divine son.
Great, thank you.
So this question is pointed towards Dr. McLatchie. So you mentioned, obviously it wasn't like one of the core arguments, but you mentioned that the existence of Israel as a nation, the continued existence of Israel, is evidence for theism. And I'd wondered why it is that the existence requires theism. Like, obviously I think there's other explanations that would give a legitimate explanation to why it exists. I can understand a little bit the argument of Israel up to the point of Jesus' birth, but you mentioned also the Holocaust and the continued existence, and I wondered how the continued existence requires theism.
Right, it doesn't, is the short answer. So I don't think that would be sufficient evidence to conclude that the God of Israel exists, but it does move the needle in that direction, because when we're trying to conceive of what is evidence, we want to really assess a likelihood ratio. What's the probability of that evidence existing given the hypothesis being true versus the probability of that evidence existing given the hypothesis is false? And so if to say that X counts as evidence for Y, what we're really saying is that the probability of that evidence existing is greater given the hypothesis than given its falsity. So when it comes to the survival of the Jewish people and nation of Israel against all odds, that's something that's highly expected on the hypothesis that the God of Israel as revealed in Scripture exists. But it's not particularly well expected on its falsity, especially when you look at all the ordeals that the nation of Israel has been through. You've got the Assyrian invasion under Sennacherib during the days of Hezekiah. You've got the Babylonian exile in the 6th century, and the Persian conquest, and Haman, which is written of in the book of Esther, and his plot to exterminate the Jews. You've got Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC, who was kind of the ancient equivalent of Adolf Hitler, who wanted to abolish the Jewish customs and the Jewish religious practices and so forth. And you've got the siege of Jerusalem, and you've got the Nazi Holocaust and so forth. And in spite of all of those trials, the nation of Israel has survived against all odds, which is not sufficient to conclude that the God of Israel exists, but it is evidence that moves the needle in that direction. Does that answer your question?
It does a little bit. I understand, like, it's obviously just like a probabilistic argument.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like this like
Right.
solves the case, obviously. But I would think, like, also, like, there's obviously other nations that have existed for, I would say, even longer, or empires have existed for just as long, if not longer, than the nation of Israel. And so, like, how would you explain some of that?
Yeah, so as I said, it's a probabilistic argument. It's an inductive argument. It's not meant to be sufficient evidence on its own. But it's the number of attempts that have been made to exterminate the Jewish people and their survival in spite of those odds, even in sometimes miraculous or very providential ways. I mean, read the books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, for example. There may be legendary embellishments in there somewhere, in some places, but so I'm saying it's evidence, it's not proof, and it's not sufficient evidence. So that's an important distinction, I think.
Thank you.
All right, thank you for your questions. I think we'll turn to, you can go ahead and come forward, but we'll turn to one from the YouTube chat. So if you are on YouTube, please address your question to an individual debater. Otherwise, I won't know who to ask, and so I'll have to skip to the next one. So feel free to re-ask a question if you intended for me to take it, and I'll just go in order here. So first from Toby Windgasson. I don't know if I pronounced your last name right, but to Alex, what convinced you to be an atheist? And I assume in opposition to agnostic. I don't know exactly where that question is coming from. I guess feel free to take it however you want.
Yeah, if the questioner seeks to imply that atheism, at least if the way he's using atheism, I don't know where to look, maybe up here, is saying that atheism is the belief that there is no God, I would say that I'm not an atheist. That is, I don't believe there is no God. I just don't believe that there is one. Online, colloquially, this is often called atheism. I recognize that in the academy it tends not to be used in that way. So it kind of depends on the context of the discussion as to whether I call myself an atheist. Of course, if I'm having a debate like one now, and it's theism, one of the reasons that we kind of decided to say naturalism is to avoid this confusion about whether I believe there is no God. But I'd happily defend an atheistic hypothesis without being a strong atheist. In other words, if I'm going to remain a passive atheist who just doesn't believe that God exists, rather than believing that there is not a God, then if somebody provides an argument in favor of theism, I might reply with an argument as to why God doesn't exist, and they kind of meet in the middle, and I'm left in this place of being unconvinced. So I wasn't convinced to be an atheist in that sense, because I'm not one. But if you mean what convinced me to have a lack of belief in God, seems like a weird question, but of course I was brought up as a Catholic. I think originally it was probably just the realization that my beliefs were based on dogma rather than philosophical investigation or something, and I decided to basically start from the ground up, reevaluating the God question, something I didn't realize at the time would be documented in quite high detail on youtube.com, but you can actually go and watch that progression for yourself.
All right, go ahead.
All right, my question is addressed to you, Alex, and then a tangent of it could be for you as well, Jonathan, if we want to go there. So, based off of what you said, Alex, personal testimony, off your own testimony, experience is important. You mentioned that if something would convince you that there is a God, it would be personal experience. So when we look at the 7 billion people in the world, there are millions of people who have these religious experiences, as we want to call them. And some of those are Christian, and those are the question. Those are the experiences I want to address to you. And then the ones, Jonathan, that maybe you can answer are the Hindu, the Muslim experiences where they feel something supernatural. So first, I want to address you, Alex. So what about specifically, there are many situations where there is evidence of a demon in someone's life. And there are many documents of this happening, like many stories. And in those situations, there is the power of Jesus' name over the demon. And so I see 2 or 3 responses to that. One would be to say that Jesus is God.
Maybe let Alex frame the responses,
All right.
and you can ask the
Okay.
question. Yeah.
I would be interested in maybe just hear, if they're brief, the other 2 explanations that you think
Sure.
of.
Okay.
So Jesus is the Son of God.
The other is that the experience is invalid.
Mhm.
That's just they're making up.
Yep.
They're lying.
Or
and then the
mistake.
other would be hallucination or something like
Or
that.
the mistaken. Okay, so of those 3 explanations of such experiences, of course, you'd have to provide a specific example for me to comment on it, but I would imagine that I'd be most likely to think that they're hallucinating, and that if they're either hallucinating or being sincere. I certainly haven't heard of any convincing descriptions of demons being driven out by Jesus that would certainly not that would convince me that Jesus is the Son of God, and even enough to believe that the experience was legitimate or properly recorded. I guess I'm just committed to the view that experience is invalid. Of course, it's going to be real to the people who experience it, but as you point out, there are religious experiences for different religions, at least some of which will be incompatible. They're not automatically incompatible. Somebody may have just an experience of God, and then afterwards, because they're in a Christian culture, decide, okay, I should be a Christian. Another person could have the same experience on the Arabian Peninsula, and then think, oh, okay, God exists, I should be a Muslim. So it's not immediately obvious that because people have contradictory religious experiences, this is enough to say that the experiences are invalid, because it could just be that they're all having a theism experience and they've taken Christianity from it. But of course, as most of the conversion stories to Christianity involve some vision of Jesus. Of course, Jesus is a prophet in Islam too, but people tend to come away from the vision with the distinct impression that Jesus is God, that Jesus is the Son of God, and this is the nature of their experience. This kind of thing is incompatible with specifically Muslim or specifically Hindu experiences, and so the fact of these contradictory notions, I would ask the same thing to you that you asked me about the demons, of somebody who very convincingly tells you that they've seen a vision of Jesus, or I guess if you're a Christian, that they've seen a vision of Muhammad or something, and they say, look, the options here are either that Islam is true, that I'm mistaken, or that I'm lying. I think you would pretty much immediately just conclude that they're at least mistaken, and that's exactly how I feel about the experiences that you relate.
And that your question to me was the one I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
Dr. McLatchie.
So you wanted to ask me about the experience of the Hindu?
Yeah. If this is it feels like it's an important question because there are so many. We have religions in most continents, or in every continent, where there are people, and so why are these experiences happening? How do you explain that? Whether it's a Christian experience or Hindu, and it's just everyone hallucinating?
Yeah, I mean, I can't claim to speak for that because I'm not a Hindu, so I don't have that available to cross-examine and inspect. So I can't really speak to that. I'm skeptical of saying that kind of mystical inner religious experiences are veridical. My confidence in Christianity is based exclusively on the public evidence that Christianity is true. It's possible that people in other religions who experience some sort of mystical experience, something like that, it's possible that there are demonic forces, but I wouldn't say that I've looked into it sufficiently to be able to say that with confidence.
Can I just add, by the way, because I did, in considering this idea of Paul potentially having an epileptic fit, I found an interesting study which speaks a little bit to what we're talking about here, which is people having a religious experience and coming to believe very specific things, like that Christianity is true. And I have it in front of me because I did copy it down in case it came up, which is that it was in 2016, some Israeli researchers at a medical center were treating an epileptic man. They were scanning his brain, and during this study, the man had a seizure, and they write, and I quote, "While lying in bed, the patient abruptly froze and stared at the ceiling for several minutes, stating later that he felt God was approaching him. The patient then got up, unplugged himself, proclaimed that God had ordered him to bring redemption to the people of Israel." And the researchers also said that this person wasn't particularly religious before the seizure, but abruptly detached the electrodes, got up, and walked around the department trying to convince people to follow him, stating that God has sent me to him. So here's an example of something which we can pretty much guarantee, because of the circumstances in which this vision occurred, that it was an illegitimate vision, a hallucination. And yet, this isn't just some kind of vague idea of the Mysterium Tremendum et Fascinans. This is, God has sent me to vindicate the people of Israel. This kind of thing does happen, and I think that would offer a better explanation of those kinds of
Briefly, in terms of epileptic seizures, my understanding is that people that experience epileptic seizures tend to have a memory gap in the period where they were having the seizure. Whereas in Acts 9, Paul has memory of what he experienced, and then also notice that he's not only blinded, but he's also healed by Ananias.
Yes,
right?
there is that too. But I don't know how much time we have, and I wanted to make sure. I think there's one more question I'm hoping we'd have time to at least hear.
Yeah, I think it'd be best to move on.
Sure.
We are up in terms of 20 minutes, but if both debaters are okay with it, I'd be happy to extend the question and answer time for a little bit longer.
That'd be if it's okay with you, since you've been said that. Thanks for your question, by the way. Yeah, it'd be good to hear.
I am gonna go back to one more online though before I get to you. I think we'll have time for both. This one is addressed to Dr. McLatchie. The question is, does Jonathan think, this is from Michael X, does Jonathan think that the intrinsic probability of this hypothesis, and I don't know what the antecedent is there, or excuse me, his hypothesis, that explains it, is significantly reduced by expanding it from theism to Christianity? Christianity entails many more propositions than theism.
Yeah, I mean, Christianity entails some more propositions. I mean, I don't think that Christianity necessarily entails the truth of every single verse in the Bible, for example. Certainly, you are increasing the proposition load, and so the intrinsic probability of the overall thesis is going to decrease. So the intrinsic probability of Christianity is lower than the intrinsic probability of Christianity of theism, because there are more propositions. However, I think that there is very compelling lines of evidence for Christianity which make the posterior probability, in my opinion, almost beyond question.
All right, go ahead.
This question's for Jonathan McLatchie. Mm-hmm. So you said that Romans 1:18 through 19 is applied to those in Rome at the time. And I just was confused by that point. I wanted to hear your explanation on it. In the verses that you're talking about seem to be very obviously talking about the world and everyone. So verse 18 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, all unrighteousness of men." So this seems to exclude.
So just to clarify, I didn't say that it's about people in Rome, but I think that it's referring to a limited set of people. It's referring to examples of people who suppress the truth and unrighteousness, because. So I don't think it's necessarily referring to every individual without exception.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
I think so. And then I guess verse 21 says, since it's talking about creation, and it seems like creation, the evidence coming from creation would mean that this applies to everyone who experiences creation and interacts with it. So it does seem to be
Right.
broader
So-
than just like a select group of people, but anyone who has senses, whether it's even
Sure.
just limited senses, would
Sure,
be able
it's
to.
the people, the class that I described as limited is those that suppress the truth and unrighteousness. So I think that Scripture does. I think that natural theology is sufficient grounds for all people to come to a knowledge of God's existence. So I think that Paul is correct in Romans 1 that the existence of God is obvious in creation. But I don't think that Christianity particularly is obvious from creation. I think that that nature makes it less than obvious that there's nothing to the Christian claim, which I think makes it incumbent upon one to go and investigate the evidence for Christianity almost to the same extent that it would be if they were very nearly persuaded of its truth. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you
Okay.
for clarifying.
Mhm.
I actually have a second question. If
Yeah.
that's okay.
I think we'll go to someone online
Okay.
just for fairness sake, and
Okay.
maybe we can do one more. Is that good enough?
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I don't know if it's a brief question. It's just because everybody else got to ask too if they want
It's
to.
true. It's true. Go
Okay,
ahead.
it is a brief question. Alex said in his opening statement, or he asked the question, "What should I do next?"
Yeah.
And his testimony, his story, is a common one, especially in Christian youth who have the same question: "What do I do next? I've done everything. I was raised in this. I'm in the right location." I guess what's your
Yeah, I would encourage you to study the evidence of the resurrection, in particular. I always encourage people to study the evidence for the robust reliability of the Gospels and Acts and how that bears on the proposition that Jesus in fact rose from the dead. And I think that one that takes the time to make oneself fully informed and is doing one's best to be rational and objective with the evidence will, in my view, in the long run, come to find Christianity to be true and well supported. And so I would invite Alex to do that inquiry.
Thank you. I think we'll take one more question from online. We have probably dozens, if not more, here in the YouTube chat. So I apologize for those of you who we're not going to get to. But this one is from Leo Behe for Jonathan.
Just Mike's
Is
Behe's
it-
son.
Just wondering if there's a connection.
Okay.
Is that really?
Yes, it is.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I'm very sorry if I said anything disparaging. What is it I said about it again? Actually, I think he's quite a good writer.
No, Leo's an atheist, but yeah.
Oh, yeah, well, then I take it back.
So, what was the question then?
Yeah, sorry. For Jonathan, is it possible to rigorously define how the supernatural could interact with the natural world, and if so, how?
Is it possible to determine how the supernatural interacts with the natural world? No, I don't think that we can. In the same way that I don't think that we really can get a handle on how mind interacts with matter. We don't understand how the mind interacts with the material brain in the same way that I don't think we can understand how the supernatural interacts with the material world, that we nonetheless, I think, can have sufficient justification for believing that there is a supernatural realm, even if we don't understand the how that interacts with the material world. So,
Unless, of course, the mind is just the brain, in which case there's no interaction problem. And similarly, maybe the answer of God's intervention with the natural world might be answered by the fact that he's not, in fact, supernatural, but a very natural creation of the human brain itself. It's an alternative hypothesis, which I think offers a better account of reality.
yes, that's a whole other debate.
All right. For more of this, so the closing statements, which we will be having next. So I'll invite Dr. McLatchie first, and as Alex, you can maybe return to your table. And
Yeah,
we'll have
sure.
5 minutes for closing statements, and we can hear your synopsis of the debate. Yes.
All right, well, thanks so much, everyone, for coming out this evening to hear this debate. I just want to remind you of the arguments I made in my opening statement. I majored on the evidence of biology in the evidence from the life sciences for intelligent design. We looked at information content intrinsic to the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA, and how information content is best explained by an intelligent cause. In every other realm of experience, when we encounter information content, we habitually associate that with conscious deliberation. And so when we find information content in the digital form in DNA, RNA, the best explanation, in my judgment, is that it too arose by virtue of an intelligent cause. That observation is rendered more probable on the supposition of theism than it is on the supposition of atheism, and therefore it tends to confirm the design hypothesis. We also looked at the fine-tuning of the genetic code, and we saw that the genetic code is highly optimized for error minimization. That was just one level of the fine-tuning of the genetic code. We could also talk about other features, such as the fact that the most frequently used codons, for example, the codon that codes for glutamine, overlap with the codons that are stop codons, that signal for stopping translation, which is a designed feature to mitigate the effects of frame shift errors, where you have an insertion or deletion that's not divisible by 3 that shifts the reading frame. But this fine-tuning feature of the genetic code results in the accumulation of stop codons and stops translations. That's another design feature of the genetic code, and we could go on. And so the high optimization of the genetic code, again, is evidence of design, because the changing or monkeying about with the codon amino acid mapping system of the genetic code wreaks havoc upon the cell, because you're changing every protein produced by the cell. So again, pointing to design. There's also other arguments that we could develop. We developed irreducible complexity. We talked about DNA replication and how that's a real headache for Darwinism, because you need self-replication for natural selection to even work. And so you can't appeal to natural selection without assuming the existence of the very thing you're trying to explain. There's also other arguments we could have talked about. We didn't get into any detail on the fine-tuning argument of the laws and constants of our universe, the fact the universe seems to have had a beginning, which again is more likely if theism is true than on its falsehood, and so forth. And we talked about the case for the resurrection of Jesus. And I don't think that my opponent this evening has really dealt with certainly the arguments for intelligent design that point to the existence of God. We showed that he was ill-informed in regards to Ken Miller's rebuttal to Mike Behe. There was no response to the fine-tuning of the genetic code, or the irreducible complexity of DNA replication machinery, or the information content in the cell, besides that it was the God of the gaps argument, which was seen to be a flawed objection, because it's a positive argument. It's arguing that this feature of the world is rendered more likely on the supposition of theism relative to its falsehood, and so it increases the probability of theism being true relative to what it would have been otherwise. I also don't think that my opponent is really seriously engaged with the case for the resurrection that I developed. Obviously, we could go into a lot more detail about the resurrection. There's numerous lines of evidence that establish that the Gospels and Acts are based in the testimony of eyewitnesses. That these witnesses are habitually scrupulous, they're close up to the facts, they're reliable and informed. And that evidence comes from both internal evidences, that between undesigned coincidences that connect in very casual ways the Gospels, where one story might mention in passing a detail that answers in passing some natural question raised by another, for example. They're also supported by extra-biblical secular sources that incidentally corroborate multiple aspects of the Gospels and Acts. And so if these are indeed rooted in credible eyewitness testimony, then the resurrection accounts also reflect the testimony of eyewitnesses. And so when we look at the nature of the resurrection claim, we find that they are multisensory, involving multiple sensory modes. They're group sightings, group conversations, physical contact, long discourses, and so on. And that's very difficult to account for by the hypothesis of some sort of shared hallucination experience or something like that. And the fact that the apostles are willing to voluntarily endure sufferings and labors and dangers and hardships and persecutions and in some cases martyrdom is also evidence that tends to confirm the sincerity, and so you redistribute the probabilities confirming the resurrection of Jesus as the best explanation. I also think that there are other independent lines of evidence that bear on Jesus' messianic and divine identity, and that is relevant to our assessment of the intrinsic probability of Jesus' resurrection as being not particularly low. So I will finish there and turn over to Alex for his closing statement. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks again. How long do I have here?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. It's always hard to do a closing statement because I like to reference things that have been said, but it means you can't write something conclusive in advance. That would be quite strange to do indeed. So what have we heard? Or maybe something that hasn't been said, which is that the problem of suffering, as I've put it forward, is often thought of as a response to religion. That is, you have this thing, this religion, this theism, and as a response to this, people say, well, what about my suffering? What about my experience? What about my nihilism on my worst days? How is this explained by your religion? But I think this is an inaccurate account of how the dialectic evolved. Indeed, I think that rather than the problem of suffering being a response to religion, it's rather religion that is a response to the problem of suffering. Some of the best and most eloquent expressions of the absurdity of human experience and the futility of our toiling, you can see where I'm going with this, is not found in sort of modern atheistic writers trying to criticize the Gospels or something, but found itself in Scripture. It's found in Ecclesiastes, which is perhaps the most concise summary of the nihilistic position that exists. In other words, it's not like this isn't something that was known about, but it clues me into the idea that maybe religion springs up as a way to combat this human experience, as a way to protect ourselves against the nihilistic experience that we've all been familiar with at least once in our lives, rather than the problem of suffering being a direct response to theism, which I think maybe that approach might slightly cause us to undercut our confidence in the truth of theism, it being a response to this condition. Of course, Jonathan says that he does a kind of Morean shift, which is to say, if God exists, then unjustified suffering doesn't exist. I say unjustified suffering does exist, therefore God doesn't exist. Jonathan says, but God does exist, therefore unjustified suffering doesn't exist. Of course, this would leave us in a situation where, and I think Jonathan would accept this easily, that there are going to be kinds of suffering that we cannot know the answer to. And this is another thing that's recorded within the wisdom literature in the book of Job, when Job asks for an explanation of his suffering, and is not just told, well, look, I'm sorry, I can't give you the answer, you wouldn't possibly understand it, but he was chastised for it. There's a kind of angry wrath that comes out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? And then a whole series of lambastations. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth, and so on, as if the teaching is something like, not only should you expect to suffer and not be able to understand why, but how dare you even try to inquire as to whether there is an answer? How could you question this? You must just accept that I'm here and that I know what I'm doing. This seems to me maybe problematic. We've kind of talked about two arguments in detail tonight, which are at least from Jonathan's side, which are the DNA replication and the case for the resurrection. Jonathan just said in his closing statement that the gospel writers are habitually scrupulous. We didn't have time to talk about some of the areas in which the gospels do seem to potentially contradict each other, or at least are questionably ascribed to scrupulous writers. Jonathan says that they're scrupulous writers, and then suggests that maybe Mark just kind of didn't mention the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus, which seems a little bit strange. Maybe he had better reason not to mention them. But also, of course, in the Gospel of John, Mary runs to the disciples after seeing the empty tomb and says that they have taken the Lord and we do not know where they have put him. This is a strange thing for her to say after running back to the disciples from the cave, if she was in fact visited by an angel at the cave who told her exactly where Jesus was going and that he was in Galilee, or indeed if she was visited herself, as Matthew and Luke say that she was. Why would she then run to the disciples and say, as is reported in John, that she does not know where they've taken the Lord? This seems a little bit strange and, shall we say, unscrupulous. Also, of course, things like the grand earthquake that's only mentioned in one gospel, and as well, Matthew mentions that at the time of the resurrection, a great deal of the dead in Israel rise from their graves and start walking around, and this is also something that's only reported in one gospel. It is, of course, an argument from silence to say that it's problematic that this isn't reported in the rest of the Gospels, but we have to ask why this would be the case. I didn't have time to ask Jonathan if he thinks that that's literally true, that people did actually rise from their graves at the time of the resurrection and start walking around. But if you don't think that that's true, then perhaps the writers were either more allegorical than we took them for, or less scrupulous than we took them for. I'm getting the eyes that I need to sit back down, so thanks.
Well, thank you very much to both of you, both for your time in preparation and just the care with which you presented your arguments to us this evening, and again for your, I think, honesty and civility in addressing questions and interacting with each other. I'm very grateful. And obviously, for those of you who are listening, we have barely scratched the surface of the different possible topics and the different considerations, and even the things that the debaters did address were addressed on a level that I'm sure both of them would consider did not do them sufficient justice for a thorough investigation. So that leaves, I think, all of us, including you, with, I guess it could be a challenge or an opportunity to take this as a starting point or a continuation point for investigating these things on your own and wrestling with what was presented here. So with that, let's give our debaters a round of applause again and thank them for their time.